headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 10, I'm Nadira Tudor. The government insists free lateral flow tests for the public will continue despite leaks suggesting they'll be scaled back. The Djokovic drama continues. Lawyers say he was sleep deprived when he was pressured into cancelling his own visa. And England secure a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. The Education Secretary says the government has no plans to scale back free lateral flow tests to high-risk settings. It comes after a report in the Sunday Times claimed that free tests would only be made available to essential workers. Nadeem Zahawi has also become the first cabinet minister to come out in support of cutting isolation to 5 days. A surge in Omicron cases has led to staff shortages in various sectors. 7 people have died and 9 others have been seriously hurt after a slab of rock broke off a cliff in Brazil and hit pleasure boaters near a waterfall below. At least 2 vessels were hit in the incident between the towns of São José de Barra and Capitolio. 3 people are still missing. The local fire department has now deployed divers and helicopters to help locate those who cannot be found. The legal team working for tennis star Novak Djokovic claim he was sleep deprived and pressured by Australian officials to cancel his visa after being detained at Melbourne Airport. It comes after it emerged yesterday that the world number 1 had a medical exemption after testing positive for COVID on December the 16th. The row over whether he'll have to be deported from the country will be heard in a court tomorrow. But those who've been following his case say he should not be given special privileges.
I think if it's our rule, it's our rule. That's it. No jab, no pray.
The decision's definitely a tough one to make, but in my opinion, I'd side with the Australian court and kick him out of the country.
I've just flown in from New Zealand and, I suppose the rules were pretty clear in terms of what you needed to provide with coming into Victoria.
England have secured a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. They battered out the final day in Sydney, finishing on 270 for 9. Stuart Broad and James Anderson saw out the final 2 overs to avoid going 4-0 down in the series. And new photographs of the Duchess of Cambridge have been released to mark her 40th birthday. The portraits, which were taken last November at Kew Gardens in London, show her in relaxed poses, wearing different Alexander McQueen dresses. They'll eventually become part of the permanent collection at the National Portrait Gallery once it reopens. And your weather, showers for those in the north and west today, but mostly fine and dry elsewhere. Cloudier later with a chance of fog for some, highs of 7 degrees. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Mid-morning talk.
Sunday Talk. Talk Radio. Take a chance with the Tice Man.
Talk Radio. Richard Tice. Sunday morning devotion, there isn't a sermon.
Talk Radio's Common Sense Weekend.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
And a very warm and bright welcome. Sunday the 9th of January, it's just gone 10 o'clock and the sky is blue and cheery out there. I hope you are having a bright and cheery Sunday morning. And we've got a optimistic, enthusiastic show ahead. Lots to look forward to. What a week it's just been, hasn't it? And my goodness me, we'll talk about it a bit later. Wasn't Sajid Javid taught a lesson on Friday by a medic about the lunacy of vaccine mandates? But I'm going to be with my big exclusive, 11:45. Make sure wherever you are, whatever you're doing, don't miss it. 11:45, I've got the top sports cardiologist, probably in the country almost, who advises the FA, Premier League clubs, the Rugby League. He's going to be talking to me about concerns about footballers, following my interview last week with Matt Letizier. That is a must listen, a must watch. We're going to be talking about lithium mining. Who knew we had masses and masses of lithium in Cornwall? I love buying British. We're going to be talking about Brexit paperwork, social care staffing crisis. By popular demand, I've got Jeremy Richardson back, the CEO of a major healthcare group. We're going to be talking about the government U-turn on cladding coming, we think, tomorrow, Kazakhstan, and much, much more with guests, MPs, chief execs, professors, you name it. I've got it here on Tice Talk. And my big question to you, the big question I want your views on, is the vaccine mandate for NHS and social care staff. Should the government reverse it? That's my big question to you. But whatever you want to talk about, tweet about, text about, the show is much better with you. You know the number, 0344 499 1000. Text 87222 mentioning the word talk, or tweet us at Talk Radio. And of course, you can watch downloading the app. It's on the website, YouTube, Apple TV, Samsung, Roku, Rakuten. There is no excuse not to watch if you'd rather than listen. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Richard Tice
on Talk Radio.
And a very good morning and a warm welcome to you. And as usual, I like to start the show with, yes, my own version of a Sunday sermon. And in a sense, I think this is a moment where I see change coming. And I want to embrace that and, in a sense, sing loudly from the choir stalls and from the rafters. Because I think, actually, the more I've looked at it, this is going to be a year of change, and also a year of U-turns. And it's not just England overnight in the cricket avoiding defeat for the first time in this Ashes series. My goodness me, the cricket fans amongst you will know just how close that was. No, there's much, much more than that. The big change, of course, is that we're going to be moving away from COVID dominating everything. We're going to move away, for example, from free mass testing. I had Dr. Clive Dix on earlier in the week, and he said we should stop testing altogether. And his view is important because he was the former chair of the vaccine task force. And I think that debate now, it's a legitimate debate. We're allowed to discuss some of these things that we couldn't discuss just weeks ago. So I think there's big change coming in the issue of testing. The Sunday Times today reporting that free testing may end quite soon. And I think there's also change coming again to the isolation period. Within just weeks, I think it'll be reduced from 7 days to 5 days. And you had Nadeem Sahawi just in the last 48 hours saying that actually he would support that if the advisors recommended it. I think that's significant. I really, really do. And I think there'll be change to some of the advisors that the government has been listening to. And I've called for that before. and I think it's coming. I think there'll be more challenge to some of the advisors. More and more people are now really beginning to question the wisdom of some of the previous COVID policies. So that's good. And there's other change coming. I think finally, actually, government policy may start to change. It may start to U-turn. It may even start to actually listen to some common sense, because there is a massively, hugely important intervention in today's Mail on Sunday from none other than the former Brexit minister, yes, Lord Frost, who resigned dramatically that Saturday night just before Christmas. He's in the Mail today, a big double-page spread. You've got to read it. Just get hold of a copy by whatever means. Fascinating headline. Right leader, wrong people, wrong policies. I'll just repeat that. Right leader, wrong people, wrong policies. Pretty dramatic stuff. So he's supporting Boris as the Prime Minister. I'm sure you've all got your views on that. But what he's saying is he's got the wrong advisors around him, he's listening to the wrong people, and he's got the wrong policies. You couldn't get more succinct, more dramatic, more significant intervention from a former cabinet minister who resigned on principle, and all credit to him. A man who actually believes in Brexit. And he said, actually he's a man after my own heart, maybe I can get him to join me. He said that we've got to cut taxes. Well, I've been calling for that for a year. He said we've got to change our energy policy. Well, I've been calling for that for a year. This is a really significant intervention. You've got others like Jacob Rees-Mogg calling for taxes to be cut, for certain the national insurance increases to be reversed. So I think there's change coming. I think the door is opening, and I don't think it's going to shut again. We've got a U-turn coming possibly as soon as tomorrow on the cladding scandal. And again, I've been calling for dramatic change to the government's woeful policy on cladding since last March. I put forward a detailed proposal. I'll be talking to Sir Peter Bottomley later about what he thinks should happen. I think change is coming. I think there will be a U-turn on this mad mandate, in my view. I think it's mad, but you may have a different view. Give us a call. This mandate to vaccinate, compulsory vaccinations for NHS staff and social care staff. And we'll be talking later to the head of a big social care group. But I think change is coming on that. I think there'll be a U-turn on vaccine passports. They've been tried all over the world. And guess what? We now know the real world evidence. Forget the theories, forget the computer models. The real world evidence is they don't work. They make zero difference. I mean, look at Wales, for example. They've had vaccine passports and their COVID rates, cases per 100,000, they're higher than England. There we go. I think there'll be a U-turn on masks. I think there's change coming on that after the ludicrous evidence, in inverted commas, released this week by Nadeem Zahawi. I think there's change coming on the national insurance tax rise. I think that'll be either reduced or hopefully scrapped. Frankly, we should be cutting taxes hard for the least well off, the lowest paid and smaller businesses. That's how you get growth. And the other big change that's coming is on gas and energy policy. Yes, I think as the government sees these gas prices soaring, energy prices going through the roof, literally in people's homes, then I think they will realise that either they change or there's going to be a revolt. I think also, and I'm possibly being a bit optimistic, I hope not naive here, I think there's change coming on the woke debate, the culture wars, the woke warriors. Indeed, even Lord Frost referred to it as an important battle that he didn't think that the Conservative government was dealing with appropriately enough, properly enough. There's only one area that I can really think of, but you might have your own views, that I sadly feel there won't be any change coming, and that is the growth in the number of illegal channel crossings. I think that will increase as opposed to decrease. That's my one concern, that's my biggest concern, where there won't be change. But my glass is always half full. It's never half empty. At this time of the morning, of course, it's full of coffee or water. But I do think change is coming. But call me whether you think change is coming or whether you fear not. I want to hear from you. 0344 499 1000 or tweet us at Talk Radio, text 87222. And that is the end of today's Tice's Sunday Sermon. And coming up, we've got some great guests, great interviews. We'll be talking to Jamie Jenkins, but don't forget the big interview, the big exclusive here on Tice Talk at 11:45 in my second hour with Professor Sanjay Sharma. Make sure you don't miss it. It's Tice Talk, it's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Get a grip. Raw talk, pure energy.
More taste, more flavour, more outspoken than ever.
Clear-headed, honest opinion.
Lively debate.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk on this bright, cheery Sunday morning, the 9th of January. And we've got a busy, active show coming up. We may need 4 hours, not 3 hours. There's so much to talk about. Give us a call, 0344 499 1000. Lucy, she tweets in, Richard on Lord Frost's article, how can the leader be right if he doesn't recognise the wrongness of his advisers? Does he not have any views of his own? Lucy, that's a really good question. Some people may say that Boris just thinks of Boris. But again, the point is a leader can listen, take advice from whoever he wants. Ultimately, he has to make the decision. And if he doesn't like the advice, he should have the courage to change it. Jane says, hi Richard, they should drop the mandatory vaccine and drop the vaccine passports for the whole of the UK. The PM could do this tomorrow. Actually, I'm not sure that's right, Jane. I don't think he has got the power to change it in the devolved nations, only England, in respect of the mandatory vaccine and vaccine passports. But keep those views coming in, keep the calls coming in. I'm delighted now to be joined to talk about the latest COVID stats by Jamie Jenkins, the independent statistician and formerly the head of health statistics at the ONS. If he doesn't know how to read health stats, frankly, no one does. Jamie, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us. So, what's your take, Jamie, on the latest statistics that we're sort of seeing and reading about in regard to the number of hospitalisations in the NHS across the whole of the UK? I'd be really interested to get your views on that and how that relates to previous years, pre-COVID indeed.
Yeah, good morning, Richard. So we've obviously seen the headlines over the last few weeks since kind of mid-December with the Omicron variant in the UK, that this big rise in people going into hospital with COVID. And we were around 30, 40, 50,000 cases a day early on in December. And we're seeing the headlines of up to 200,000 a day. So because we now know the Omicron variant, and we were told this quite early on by South African scientists that it's a kind of a less deadly variant, because there's so many people, Richard, in the country now with Omicron or with COVID, we are inevitably going to see more people in hospital with COVID. So NHS England publish estimates each week on the number of patients in hospital with COVID who weren't actually in the hospital specifically because of COVID. And it used to be around 25 to 30%. But that now has been increasing since the kind of the rise of the Omicron variant. And it's around between 37 and 45% of all the patients now in English hospitals are in there with COVID, but they're not being treated for it. So that's an important thing to kind of have a distinction. Now, if we look at the intensive care side of things, the critical care side of things, we see no difference at all, Richard, in the number of patients in critical care over the last few weeks. So it's quite clear that this variant is not meant, leading to further kind of people having serious treatment.
Indeed,
and
just stopping you there, Jamie. Indeed, as I understand, the numbers in ICU are less than they were through all of November and much of October.
Indeed, and you asked the point around how many compared to previous years. So we get information published by the NHS each winter because they try to look at the kind of the winter emergency that we always have on the NHS. So on the 2nd of January, I've had a little look at the last 5 or 6 years, taking the latest figures that they published, which was the 2nd of January. So we had 3,055 patients in England in critical care just gone, 2nd of January. Now, last year, where we had this big, massive wave of, where we had that kind of originally the Kent variant, it was 3,911, a huge number over what we'd expect. But let's look at that 3,055 now. In 2020, it was 3,075. In 2019, 3,064. In 2018, when we had a kind of a mutant strain of flu, 3,270, so a couple of hundred more. And in 2017, 3,101. So the numbers of patients in critical care in England's beds at the moment is lower than any of the the 4 years leading up to the COVID pandemic.
That's absolutely fascinating, Jamie. And I think it's really important that we understand these numbers in the round, in the context, because otherwise individually they can sound frightening and scary and sometimes terrifying. But when you put it in that context, that we're basically at the same level as the 3 previous winters pre-COVID, then actually say, well, maybe that's just life as normal in a sense. More people will be in ICU every winter because it comes around every year. And very often it is the elderly who are likely to suffer more, isn't it?
No, indeed, Richard. And I think, if we were having the same conversation 2 years ago and we weren't talking about COVID, we were just talking about the NHS, I'd probably be talking to you about, huge pressures on the NHS because we just inevitably have had them every winter. And you could argue that that's down to a kind of the lack of good management of the NHS, not just from the management within the NHS, but the government themselves and the funding over, successive decades and stuff. But, it's quite clear that a lot of people are talking about, COVID patients are overrunning the NHS. Your headlines of unvaccinated COVID patients are overrunning the NHS. And the facts and the figures, when you just stop breaking them down and looking at them. So those figures as well, remember that like 3,000, it's only around 1 in 5 of the patients who are in the critical care beds, Richard, have actually got COVID. So the vast majority of them don't have COVID. And people seem to forget that because, you can turn the BBC on an evening and you'll see the journalists on the intensive care wards and they'll, talk about COVID patients there. And I think the narrative people start thinking is that everybody's got COVID. They're all on intensive care wards. So just remember, the vast majority of patients in the critical care beds, even though they're no higher than a couple of years before COVID, they are non-COVID patients as well.
That's right. I like the glass to be half full, not half empty. I fear that the BBC's glass is always permanently empty and permanently broken, because they always give the impression that there's a huge crisis. But when you just put that simple context, so only 1 in 5 ICU patients have got COVID, and the numbers in ICU are the same as the 3 previous years pre-COVID, actually, I think many people would say, okay, it's another winter, no drama. Every ICU patient is an anxiety, but it's not a reason for lots of restrictions ongoing. And in a sense, I think it gives the confidence that we've got to get our lives back, we've got to push on, and we've got to talk about the other big challenges apart from COVID.
Yeah, and I think you get those people who are obviously calling for Boris to introduce more restrictions. And, Rich, if we didn't have a pandemic where the government had to be kind of pushed into having restrictions to control it, and you look at last winter, it was significantly more patients. But you've got these people on the side of Boris, bring in more restrictions, please. They would have been calling for restrictions the last 20 years if they had their way. And if we'd been testing for the flu and cold viruses over the last 20 years, we would see a massive rise during the winter months. So that's not surprising. The good thing, I suppose, with Omicron, Rich, is that it's actually killed off these more deadly variants. So talking about the glass half full, yeah, we've got huge numbers of cases, but it's going around the country now, and it's basically making that kind of more deadly Delta variant non-existent. So I think we should be kind of rejoicing with the fact that this variant's come along, and it may even come along now to the point that we need to stop thinking about vaccinating the whole population every kind of 6 months. I think the head of the JCVI was saying it's untenable to continue to do that. And I think we had a doctor who was on a couple of days ago about mandatory vaccines. I know you're talking about today. And we do know that previous infections offer those antibodies that he was talking about. So, we've got a huge waiting list problem in the NHS.
Yes.
Getting rid of 100,000 staff is not going to help fix that. It's going to make it worse, Rich, I think.
So just coming on to staff numbers, now you mention it, and obviously there's concern about staff absence, either with COVID or that they're isolating, and it may be hopefully the isolation period comes down from 7 days to 5 days. We'll wait to hear on that over the coming weeks. But is there any data, Jamie, comparing staff absences in the NHS now, again, compared to pre-COVID years?
So we are seeing more absences now, Rich, compared to pre-COVID years. But if you're looking at actual absences, we've seen little change in non-COVID absences over the last month. And the vast majority of those, we've got more non-COVID absences actually than we have COVID. And the main reason for those kind of stress, anxiety, depression, and there's about 40,000 staff in England are roughly around that. So we have seen this rise in recent weeks in terms of the number of patients, staff in hospital. But if you go back to last year, we also saw a big rise around the January time, this time last year as well. The positive sign on the staff absences is that they're coming down in London now. So it could be that, give it a couple of weeks, a lot of people are obviously off because we're actively looking for COVID cases. And, they're damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. Because if they leave them go in, we do know there's a problem of patients catching COVID in hospital. So obviously, maybe it is good to keep the staff out. But ultimately, at some point, if Omicron is proven to kind of be this less deadly variant, we need to move to a position, Rich, where there's not a 5-day self-isolation period, there's a 0-day self-isolation
period.
And
that was why I was so fascinated by Dr. Clive Dix's view earlier this week, when he told me in his first interview ever here at Talk Radio that he felt that all testing should stop, so that because essentially we don't test for flu. Jamie, whilst you've been on, you'll love this tweet that's come in from Peter. Jamie Jenkins puts these statistics into perspective. Our government, the BBC and MSM have suppressed all of this. I will never forgive Boris for this. So there we are. You've got a fan, Jamie, from Peter in Stevenage. And I think this is really important. Also, Jamie, have you got some data for us on excess death numbers compared, again, to the 5-year average? So, again, we can put what's happening at the moment into context.
Yes, Rich. So we're going through the pandemic, the very first wave, huge numbers of excess deaths, and they were predominantly, nearly everything was down to COVID because there was no immunity in the population. significant numbers of elderly people succumb to the virus, sadly. And we saw a similar situation kind of last winter when we had the kind of virus. So, but if we look at the last couple of weeks now, where we get the figures. So just to explain where excess deaths are, basically you can look at the number of deaths in the country at the moment being registered and look at the kind of the pre-COVID numbers just to see, are we seeing more people dying than what you'd expect for the time of year? And over the last 2 weeks, we've seen around 3,115 more deaths in England and Wales than what you would expect. But if we start looking then how many of those were what have been the medical registrars putting down specifically to COVID, it's about 1,350 of them. So, we've got more non-COVID excess deaths going on at the moment than what we have with COVID, total number of COVID deaths. Remember, some of the COVID deaths, Rich, some of them may have sadly died anyway. But,
yes.
So we've got this problem with excess deaths.
So there's the last couple of weeks, there's a slight excess. I think the data I saw, Jamie, was about the last 10 weeks, cumulatively, it's almost completely flat in terms of compared to the 5-year average.
But when you start looking over the kind of the longer period since the summer, Rich, what we are seeing is the excess deaths that are coming through the numbers. They are mainly made up of kind of non-COVID patients, and and there's this fascinating. Well, I say fascinating, but it's a tragic statistic as well. In that we've had now since the start of the pandemic, almost 90,000 people have died at home in their private homes, above average than what you would have expected. It's a third higher every week, and ONS did some numbers on this. You never see these on witty and balances charts when they do in their briefing.
And that's the point. Angela's just tweeted in, Jamie, before we finish. Jamie, thank you for explaining the real data. Are these stats available to Downing Street? Because if they were, your predictions regarding the lifting of restrictions would be here sooner. I think Angela's right. Jamie, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for that. That was absolutely fantastic. That's Jamie Jenkins with some proper context about the real data. Coming up, we've got Peter Bottomley talking about cladding later in the hour. But call us 0344 499 1000. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Madeira Tudor. The government insists free lateral flow tests for the public will continue despite leaks suggesting they'll be scaled back. And England secure a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. The Education Secretary says the government has no plans to scale back free lateral flow tests to high-risk settings. It comes after a report in the Sunday Times claimed that free tests would only be made available to essential workers. Nadhim Zahawi has also become the first cabinet minister to come out in support of cutting isolation to 5 days. A surge in Omicron cases has led to staff shortages in various sectors. 7 people have died and 9 others have been seriously hurt after a slab of rock broke off a cliff in Brazil and hit pleasure boaters near a waterfall below. At least 2 vessels were hit in the incident between the towns of São José da Barra and Capitolio. 3 people are still missing. The local fire department has now deployed divers and helicopters to help locate those who cannot be found. The legal team working for tennis star Novak Djokovic claim he was sleep deprived and pressured by Australian officials to cancel his visa after being detained at Melbourne Airport. It comes after it emerged yesterday that the world number 1 had a medical exemption after testing positive for COVID on December the 16th. The row over whether he'll have to be deported from the country will be heard in a court tomorrow. England have secured a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. They batted out the final day in Sydney, finishing on 270 for 9. Stuart Broad and James Anderson saw out the final 2 overs to avoid going 4-0 down in the series. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
World headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio. Listen on DAB+.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice, Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk in the first hour of this bright, cheery morning here in central London. I hope it's bright and cheery where you are, and lots of messages coming in. Give us a call, of course, 0344 499 1000. We've got a message in here, and we'll try and get the answer to this from Jamie Jenkins, who's now left us. And the message is, what is the breakdown between Delta and Omicron in hospital? Well, we'll try and get that answer for you later in the show. And then we've got one from here, another tweet saying, Dave, he says, brilliant real facts from Jamie. Oh, Jamie for PM, there you are, Jamie. Cannot do the worse than the shambles we have got now. So keep those coming in. But Jamie, it's the clarity and the simplicity and the context of what he said. And talking of context and the ability, the importance of having real debate, real discussion, and indeed just being allowed to discuss things. Wasn't it interesting? Many of you may have seen or heard the clip that appeared on Sky News on Friday afternoon, I think it was, of an extraordinary exchange between a medic who's been working in, I think, ICU for many, many months, possibly since the COVID crisis began. And he gave a very different response to a question from the Health Secretary than perhaps the Health Secretary wanted to hear. Take a listen to this.
What do you think of the new rule to require vaccination of all NHS staff?
I'm not happy about that. So.
You're not happy about it? Tell me.
So I've had COVID at some point.
Yeah.
I've got antibodies.
Yeah.
I've been working on COVID ITU since the beginning. I have not had a vaccination. I do not want to have a vaccination. The vaccine's reducing transmission only for about 8 weeks with Delta. With Omicron, it's probably less. And for that, I would be dismissed if I don't have a vaccine. It's not. The science isn't strong enough.
That's your view. And your views? Do you have a view on that? I respect that, but there's also many places
I agree.
Completely different views.
Yep, there's other views,
yeah.
but
yeah.
And there's another colleague who's also in the same position.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I understand that. And obviously we have to weigh all that up for both health and social care. And there will always be a debate about it. But
maybe there's an opportunity to reconsider with Omicron and the changing picture, or at least to nuance it and allow doctors who've had antibody exposure, who've got antibodies, who haven't had the vaccination, to not have it, because the protection I've got from transmission is probably equivalent to someone who's vaccinated.
Yeah, but at some point that will wane as well.
But if you want to provide protection with a booster, you'd have to inject everybody every month. If it's worn off by 2 months, if the protection's worn off for transmission after 2 months, then after a month you've still got a bit of protection. So if you want to maintain protection, you're going to need to boost all staff members every single month, which you're not going to do.
Yeah, we take advice on how much you may need.
But it's not going to achieve a practical benefit.
Yeah. Well, we take the very best advice that we can.
I understand, but you're
from the people that are vaccine experts.
Absolutely fascinating, that clip, and I suspect that was definitely not what the Health Secretary expected to hear as he was going around a hospital. Extraordinary exchange. And first of all, I think the courage of that doctor, that medic, is incredible, because already you can see from social media afterwards that there's been, quite a big pushback from other people in the NHS and various journalists and people. So firstly, I would like to just admire the courage that he felt able to have that discussion. And I think it was really illuminating, and debate and discussion is good. And of course there's different views, but it was absolutely amazing to hear his thoughts, why he, having been on ICU, so he really understands it. It's not just some layman radio presenter sitting behind a desk waffling and pontificating. No, this is a real expert who's been on the front line for many, many months. And that's why I do think that, as I said in my Sunday sermon, that the government is very likely to come under pressure to reconsider its stance of mandatory vaccines for NHS staff. And I hope that does happen. And I hope it also happens for social care staff. And we'll be hearing from Jeremy Richardson later in the show. He's the chief executive of one of the biggest 4 social care groups in the country. He was on in December, and he's back by popular demand to get his views, because we know there's a staffing crisis. You just heard it from Jamie Jenkins that staff absence is much higher. Well, you're not exactly going to help that, are you, folks, if you then fire a load of staff, experienced staff, hard-working frontline staff who understand the issues, and they've made their own personal decision about their own bodies. And I think we should respect that decision, and I think we should thank them for their service and their hard work. And frankly, I think we should let them get on with it and keep working hard in the NHS, helping patients. Surely that is the right thing. But call me 0344 499 1000 with your views, your thoughts, because that is really important. And then we can get everybody's views on that. So we've got a interesting message come in here. I'm not sure whether we agree with this. Maybe they can't drop the mandates and the passports because it's part of Pfizer. Well, I don't think it is. I just think it's part of government policy. But there is obviously lots of different views on that. Interesting message that's come in here from, I think it's a tweet called Free1, saying Gloomsters admit they were wildly wrong about 75,000 Omicron deaths. I believe that Chris Whitty, Valance and Sage and Ferguson should all apologise. He says some face criminal charges for those who died in lockdown and the lack of treatments. Well, I did call earlier this week, actually, that new year, new team. It was time to thank some of the advisors, in fact, many of the advisors on Sage and Neil Ferguson, thank them and fire them, because too many of their predictions have been too wrong far too often. And the collateral damage for the country has been so significant. And yes, these absurd suggestions about up to 75,000 Omicron deaths, and thank heavens 101 Tory MPs did rebel before Christmas and did put a double-edged rod of steel into the backbone of the Prime Minister so that he didn't impose more restrictions in England, because we've got this real-life example now, haven't we, between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and it looks like that England are going to be more correct on the judgments made. There was a tweet that came in saying someone suggesting the only change they wanted was in Scotland, the removal of Nicola Sturgeon. I suspect that is optimistic thinking. But anyway, let's have... we've got another tweet just come in here from... who's this from? Tier 87, saying, even more, if someone doesn't agree with you, then there has been. No, I don't think that's right, actually. I think that debate and discussion is good, and that's really important. I think we've got a caller, Elizabeth, in... I'm not quite sure where Elizabeth is, but Elizabeth, are you there?
Hi.
In Filey. Hi, Elizabeth.
Hi. I think I wanted to say this morning, I don't think the general public have had a voice in what's been going on for the last 2 years. I personally, I don't think I've slept for a full night. I'm so concerned and so afraid about what's been happening. I think that I could never, ever again vote for the two main parties in England. Never.
Really? Because you're so concerned about how they essentially sort of adopted the same consensus of opinion.
I think that the Labour are Marxist.
And what... Well, I called the Conservatives, I renamed them the Con-Socialists. What do you think of that, Elizabeth?
I agree with you. I totally agree. And I think that the trouble it's caused within families... I come from a large family, and half my family in another town, we can hardly speak to each other because I put critical thinking into what's been happening, and they don't. I think it's a form of brainwashing that's been going on from the BBC. I'm very concerned.
Well, you're right, Elizabeth. And I said early on in this crisis that I thought the COVID crisis would create more division and more angst than Brexit. And I still hold to that view. Elizabeth, thank you so much for your views. I think we've got Ray in Nottinghamshire. Good morning, Ray.
Good morning, Richard. Love the show. Love Talk Radio altogether.
Great. And is it bright and fresh in Nottinghamshire this morning?
It's lovely. Yeah. It's
excellent.
Not bad.
What can I do for you?
Couple of things. I'm just retired, 71 years of age. Never had a day off in my life at work apart from when I had my prostate out. This is an area where, coal mining is relevant and there's Labour and all that lot, and I've always voted Conservative. But I tell you what, the next time I vote, I back your party anyway, to be honest, and Farage's as well, because I think there's a voice has got to be heard. And the voices that are being heard now by these idiots that's in government now are just absolute rubbish. They ain't got a clue what they're doing.
Well, I think as you may have heard my Sunday sermon when I said I think that change is coming. I think the pressure is growing on the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. I think they know it. And I think Lord Frost's intervention could well turn out, Ray, to be a seismic moment in this.
I hope so.
And of course, we've got May elections.
On COVID, Richard, sorry, I'm going to butt in here, but on COVID, I mean, my wife's just had COVID. I've had COVID. I'm 71, she's 61. I got COVID quite bad, really. Weren't very good. I'm getting on a bit, but I'm a fit guy. I was worked all my life. But my wife got it very mildly. And she said that when the people from the National Register rang up and said, "Oh, hey, going on with COVID and all this rubbish," she says, "Well, I'd sooner have COVID than flu, because when I get flu, I'm out for 3 weeks." You know?
There you are. No, there's many. It affects people, so many different people, Ray, in so many different ways. Ray, thank you so much for that. We've got to move on, but thanks for that call, Ray in Nottinghamshire there, with his concerns about the government, their policies, and not enough change. Keep the calls coming in 0344 499 1000. Coming up, Sir Peter Bottomley, we're talking about the other U-turn that's coming this week on cladding. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Best recipe ever.
Pan-national agitated debate and discussion.
Radio with an answer for everything.
Powered by your opinions. Something to talk about.
Talk Radio.
The home of common sense.
Welcome back to Tice Talk this Sunday morning. And don't forget, at the end of the second hour, I've got the exclusive interview with Professor Sanjay Sharma, sports cardiologist to many Premier League football teams and the FA and the Rugby League. So that is going to be fascinating. But now we've got to talk about another of the issues where I do think there's going to be a big U-turn, and it looks as though it's coming this week. And that's on this issue of the cladding scandal following the absolute disaster, the tragedy of Grenfell Tower, the changes to cladding required where the cladding breaches regulations and is unsafe. But for many, many months, the previous Housing Secretary, Robert Jenrick, he was absolutely determined to stick to a policy that essentially imposed huge costs, massive costs, on leaseholders who were the only innocent party in this whole scandal. And last March, I put forward a clear 3-point plan to resolve this crisis that would give a guarantee that leaseholders didn't have to pay for cladding replacement and related fire safety issues, and that the polluter would pay, i.e. the industry, whether it's the manufacturers of the cladding or the house builders or a combination thereof. And finally, following the change in the Housing Secretary, which is now Michael Gove, who's got a job title that is longer than most people's arms, or 2 arms. But within that, it does look as though he's looked at this and recognised there is a problem, and he's going to announce some changes this week. And I'm delighted to be joined now by Sir Peter Bottomley, who's the chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Leasehold and Commonhold Reform and Conservative MP for Worthing West. Sir Peter, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining me. So it looks as though there's a big change coming, possibly in the next couple of days, from Michael Gove, Sir Peter. Is he going to say what you want him to hear, or is there going to be more to come?
Well, what he's saying, I anticipate, will be right. And the logic, as you pointed out some months ago, and as we've been pointing out since Grenfell, and as Sir David Amess was pointing out before Grenfell, fire safety needs to be taken seriously. Things have gone wrong, some by mistake and some deliberately. I don't know if he's going to make the change in the law, which would make those responsible without limit of time, if they knew what they were doing was unsafe, and for 6 years after people discovered the problems, for those who did it accidentally. You have to make sure that the only people who are innocent who are the leaseholders, who don't own a brick in their building by law, are not lumbered with the costs of putting right what should never have gone wrong.
That's right. And there's obviously the issue of, at the moment, the current proposal from the government was they made a difference between those who were in buildings above 18 metres high, who would receive essentially a grant to pay for the replacement of cladding, but those who were in buildings below 18 metres high, they would only receive a loan from the government, and therefore they essentially would be picking up the cost through that loan system. And I always felt that that was completely unfair. You had this sort of extraordinary situation where you could have 2 buildings next to each other in the same development of exactly the same specification, one 17 metres high, one 20 metres high, and a completely different grant system. And that hopefully is going to change.
That needs to change. And as Bob Ayling at Grosvenor Waterside pointed out by Victoria Station, that's a mixed development which has some above 18 metres, some below, but the leaseholders are in the same situation. Some would have to pay and some wouldn't. But there are 3 sets of costs facing leaseholders. One is the ludicrous waking and watch system, which the fire service bluntly ought to never to have shoved onto them. That can cost them hundreds and hundreds of pounds a month. The second are insurance premiums. Remember that the leaseholder is paying insurance for the landlord's benefit, which used to be about £300 a year, now going up to £3,000. So I think the Competition and Markets Authority ought to get after the insurance company to say this is ludicrous. If you need to have a catastrophe scheme, get the government to help you on that.
Yeah.
But don't go overcharging leaseholders. And then there's the cost of putting things right, often called remediation. But that's not just for cladding, it's also for other fire defects that people are discovering. If you had a 15-year-old car or a 15-year-old refrigerator and the manufacturer discovered they'd done it wrong, they'd come to you and without cost to you put it right. The same thing should apply to buildings. And if you look at those who are responsible, not all in every case, but some in some cases, the developers got it wrong, the builders got it wrong, the component suppliers got it wrong, the architects got it wrong, the surveyors got it wrong, the people setting the building standards, that's mainly government, got it wrong, building control, local authority or other inspectors got it wrong. Those people were all insured. If I were the housing secretary, I would get them together, the insurers around the round table, and say, look, do you want to face individual claims on behalf of leaseholders put forward by myriad landlords? There are 12,000 buildings involved. Or do you want to cut out the legal costs, agree around the table to pay out, say, £8 billion, together with £2 billion levy, £2 billion tax, and we can solve most of the problem.
That's right, because, as you say, there are actually a number of other fire safety issues that came to light when some of these cladding issues were taken off and re-looked at. which was basically bad workmanship, bad specification as the buildings were built. There is, of course, and this is something that I focused on, Sir Peter, the existing warranty system for new homes that people think is going to give them the cover, what's called the 10-year warranty from the NHBC, for which there's a small fee paid by the developers. But I can tell you, having worked in that industry, you've got more chance of meeting the Pope than you have of a successful claim from the NHBC. And I feel that actually that has a role to play here, in a sense, because that is the warranty solution for homes, and whether 10 years is the right period or maybe a bit longer. But they've got huge reserves, and actually, perhaps what should happen with all future new homes, Sir Peter, is a greater amount, maybe 1% of the sale price, goes into that warranty fund, the sort of insurance fund, in order to prepare, well, partly to repay this cost, but also to prepare for the next construction technical problem that's bound to befall at some point in the future.
I think there's something in that, and it's probable that the select committee led by Clive Betts, the Labour MP for Sheffield, can go into that. But the key point now is to say how many people, too many people, have got homes they don't know are safe and they know are not sellable. So the government have to organise a system where people actually can find the real problems, not gold plating, but the real safety problems, fix them, and then get the funding from those responsible. But if you wait until you've got the money from those responsible, you'll still have people not 4.5 years after Grenfell, but 10.5 years after Grenfell, worried at night about whether they're safe and worried in the day whether they can sell if they need to move.
Which is horrific for them. That creates so much anxiety, and so many people essentially are going to be forced into bankruptcy. So I think you're right, but that requires essentially an upfront government loan into some funding pot that is then gradually repaid as the polluter pays.
Well, I think it can be slightly different from that. I mean, the interesting people who've been thinking about this, including those who helped solve the Lloyd's of London problem, if, for example, you had an arm's length body which could borrow money as though it were government, so very, very low rates of interest, if you used existing levies and taxes to pay the running costs, you could then repay that when the claims get settled with the builders, developers, insurance companies, the surveyors, the architects and the like. And you can have that off government balance sheet. So I think there's no particular problem with finding the imaginative way of getting the money in first and then getting repaid without it necessarily being government money.
I think that's a really interesting point. That, as you say, that's a variant of my proposal. But the key here is that the innocent party, the only innocent party in reality, the leaseholder, doesn't pay, whether it's the additional fire safety remediation costs or indeed the waking watch costs.
That's right. And if Parliament's intention in 2002 with the Leasehold Reform Act had brought in common hold, the leaseholders would also be the landlord stroke freeholders, and they could make the claims against those responsible. At the moment, under leasehold, it's only the landlord stroke freeholder who can do that. They won't do it unless they're backed up by money from the leaseholders. The leaseholders haven't got money, so that's not going to work. So government also needs to find a way of getting the potential claim on behalf of leaseholders into the hands of someone strong enough to get the insurance companies, insurance industry to wake up, face the music and pay up.
I think that's right, Sir Peter, because in a sense the industry, some people knowingly, some people just through incompetence, they're responsible for this crisis, and they've got to pay up over time. And as you say, there's insurance. It's got to be dealt with. Sir Peter Bottomley, thank you so much for your thoughts. I know you've been working very hard on this issue, and I do sense again that there is change in the air here, and it's not before time, because so many hundreds of thousands of people have literally been staring into the face of bankruptcy because of these huge bills. Some people have received bills of £100,000, equal to the value of their flat, and they can't move, they can't do anything. It's not acceptable. It's got to change. I think it is going to change, and that is good news, and we'll keep banging the drum. Stay with us into the second hour, where we're going to be talking later on to Professor Sanjay Sharma, and we're also going to be looking at Brexit paperwork. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV. The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 11, I'm Nadira Tudor. The government insists free lateral flow tests for the public will continue despite leaks suggesting they'll be scaled back. The Djokovic drama continues. Australia loses a bid to delay the tennis world #1's visa hearing. And England secure a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. The Education Secretary says that the government has no plans to scale back free lateral flow tests to high-risk settings. It comes after a report in the Sunday Times claimed that free tests would only be made available to essential workers. Nadeem Zahawi has also become the first cabinet minister to come out in support of cutting isolation to 5 days. A surge in Omicron cases has led to staff shortages in various sectors. 7 people have died and 9 others have been seriously hurt after a slab of rock broke off a cliff in Brazil and hit pleasure boaters near a waterfall below. At least 2 vessels were hit in the incident between the towns of São José da Barra and Capitolio. 3 people are still missing. The local fire department has now deployed divers and helicopters to help locate those who cannot be found. The Australian government has failed in a bid to delay Novak Djokovic's visa hearing until after the Australian Open draw is finalised. His legal team claim he was sleep deprived and pressurised by officials to cancel his visa after being detained at Melbourne Airport. Yesterday it emerged that the world #1 had a medical exemption after testing positive for COVID on December the 16th. The case will be heard in a court tomorrow, but those who've been following it say he should not be given special privileges.
I think if it's our rule, it's our rule. That's it. No jab, no pray.
The decision's definitely a tough one to make, but in my opinion, I'd side with the Australian court and kick him out of the country.
I've just flown in from New Zealand and, I suppose the rules were pretty clear in terms of what you needed to provide with coming into Victoria. A no-fly zone could be placed over Windsor Castle following an incident involving a man with a bow and arrow on Christmas Day. The Met Police say they've applied for a restricted airspace order to prevent aircraft from flying up to 2,500 feet above and 1.5 nautical miles around the royal residence. And England have secured a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. They battered out the final day in Sydney, finishing on 270 for 9. Stuart Broad and James Anderson saw out the final 2 overs to avoid going 4-0 down in the series. And your weather, showers for those in the north and west today, but mostly fine and dry elsewhere. Cloudier later, with a chance of fog for some, highs of 7 degrees. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Morning Talk.
Sunday Talk.
Talk Radio.
Richard Tice.
Powered by Debate.
Sunday morning with the Tice Man. Richard Tice. The heart of a common sense Sunday.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're well into the second hour now of my 3-hour show, and we've got some great messages coming in here. One from Adam. This is an interesting one. Following the news that the COVID modelling was incorrect, shouldn't we review where else the modelling is being used by the government? For example, climate change. Interesting thought there, Adam. Actually, the quality of the modelling and the advisors is really important. There's another one saying, this is from Stuart, yes, sack the lot of the advisors. If anyone in private enterprise misforecast to this level, they would be dismissed immediately. Our taxes are paying for this and it's unacceptable. Well, I do think this is New Year, time for change. And there's another change in the air, because you remember that thing called Brexit? Well, yes, that has obviously involved change, in my view, overall very much for the better. And I know that's obviously not everybody's view, far from it. And one of the changes is to do with what happens in terms of imports and exports, and what happens with regard to declarations, be they electronic or paperwork. And there were some changes that came into force just this week, and lots of the doommongers were saying that it would lead to disaster and chaos. So I thought it'd be good to get an update from someone on the front line of this. Richard Ballantyne is the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association, so couldn't really be closer to this. Richard, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining Tice Talk. And you've obviously been close to this, and I saw you made a comment in the Telegraph sometime this week that you said, although it's been a fairly quiet start to the year, actually traders appearing to be following the rules, and it seems to be working out okay. Is that the overall experience so far?
Yes, good morning, Richard. Great to be with you, and thanks for having me on. I'd say there's been a sort of mixed experience. It's been better than some would have expected, but I have to say it is very quiet for the first couple of weeks of January in a new year with traffic-wise. But there's one or two of these customs paperwork errors, which hopefully is just a matter of time before traders get used to those kind of things. But the government's been quite clever, Richard, in phasing the introduction in. You'll recall we left the European Union over a year ago now, so it's taken a year for the government to start enforcing these rules at our borders, which I think is actually quite a clever move.
I have to say, it's an expression I don't often hear, Richard. The government's been clever. It's good to hear, particularly if it regards Brexit.
Well, it's all been quite a rush, Richard. I would say they could have been cleverer by delaying things slightly more, but we know the political pressure and the expectations that policymakers have on these changes. But I would just add a kind of word of caution, and that is further introductions of border controls. We're having things in July, which is around animal and plant products. This is where we will have potential delays and inspections at frontiers. And that means costs for importers, manufacturers, maybe even consumers. So I would say that the customs element has gone rather well, but these other animal and plant product checks, that's still to come in July.
But those checks are that you talk about coming in July, and indeed these checks at the moment, they're essentially, as I understand, but correct me if I'm wrong, at our discretion. So our inspection agents can decide how many, what percentage to essentially randomly check. Is that right?
It is right, but the government is preparing for a particular regime with a full control mechanism. So there isn't a sort of indication they're going to relax things whatsoever. And indeed, ports have built infrastructure on the expectation that these checks will be taking place on a sort of 100% type level. So yes, there is absolutely the opportunity for the UK government to change policies moving forward, but that has to be balanced with other pressures and of course all our borders. So not just European trade, but we're looking at goods that come from Asia, Africa, South America, etc. So there is a balance, Richard, of course, that has been made there.
Of course, but how many of these importers are treated essentially as, the expression is, trusted traders, who therefore, in a sense, are trusted by the government, the inspection agents, to be complying with the rules, and therefore can have a lighter touch inspection regime?
Well, I haven't got the numbers on how many traders are compliant through things like the government's AEO schemes and others, but it is growing. But for the most part, traders are doing their own thing. They're bringing in their goods, following the rules, etc., without needing to go down the trusted trader route. But I think that may be more popular moving forward. But you'd probably have to ask some of the freight and customs agencies about what they're doing in that area.
And in terms of the paperwork that is talked about, how much of that is actually genuinely paper, and what percentage would be electronic declarations that actually importers use for non-EU countries that they've been used to using, and therefore is actually part of the system and relatively quick?
No, it's all gone over to electric.
It is all electric. So this
yes,
idea that it's genuine paperwork.
Yes, it's digital paperwork, I'd say, which is a slightly confusing term, I know.
But it's an important distinction, actually, because we hear stories in terms of, I think, more on exporters, that certain lorries are having to take sort of literally lever arch files of papers.
They might need some documents to get into places like France, but the expectation is that all the paperwork should be digitally available. And one of the mechanisms to ease trade through places like Dover and New Haven and Eurotunnel, the GVMS, Goods Vehicle Movement Service. That is all digital. There's also inventory linking. This is a rather complicated term, where custom declarations at the other ports are cleared through the HMRC systems digitally.
Fascinating. So, but all of that sounds to me as though it's progressing much more rationally and logically and sensibly than many people were led to believe by certain other lobby groups who in a sense, for whatever reason, were creating more concern than was justified.
Yes, I would say I wouldn't ignore the amount of preparation the industry and government has had to do, but absolutely things are going probably better than they expected. There are some, we understand, errors being made in these digital forms. And as you can imagine, having a written document where there is an error, it's a bit more difficult to deal with that in a digital system because the computer may just say no, so to speak. But we are getting there, Richard, and I would thank the government for all its efforts, thank industry and the wider freight and logistics industry for what it's doing, but just ask for a bit more patience while we get our heads around these new systems, because it may take some time to be fully compliant across the board.
Richard, that's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much for your thoughts. And there we are. More good news, folks. I'm going to have to repeat that. Change is coming. Good news. Brexit is working. That was Richard Ballantyne, the chief executive of the British Ports Association. He's on the front line. He knows what's going on. He's not one of these scaremongers, the people who didn't want Brexit to happen, who said it would be disaster, it would be chaos, there would be reams and reams of paperwork. It's not paperwork. It's simple electronic declarations. It's what importers and exporters do when they're importing and exporting to third countries outside the European Union. And yes, there's been some hard work. Yes, the private sector has rolled its sleeves up, got stuck in, made it happen. That's what they do. That's what businesses do when they want to make a profit. There's a challenge ahead. They've done it. They've sorted it. They're on top of it. And look, credit where credit's due. For Richard Ballantyne to say that the government has been quite clever on this, and therefore various government departments, I have to say that's great news. I'm going to celebrate that. I genuinely, it almost brings a tear to my eye that things are working despite all the gloomsters, the doomsters. I may have to take a pause and just sort of think about it, because we hear so much grim news that Brexit's going to be a disaster. And there you have it. The man on the front line who knows what's going on, actually, it's working. People have made it work. People have got together. They've organised stuff. And yes, there'll be another issue in the summer with regard to plant and live animals. But my view is, if we've been able to overcome it so far, there's every prospect we'll overcome it going forwards. But the big challenge ahead of us is, of course, Northern Ireland, the protocol, and what's Liz Truss going to do with those negotiations. But there we are, folks. Good news, change, and change is coming. The glass is definitely half full this morning. It is not half empty. Coming up, we'll take your calls 0344 499 1000, your tweets, your texts. There's lots coming in. I want to hear from you. In particular, your thoughts. Should the government U-turn and stop the mandatory vaccinations of NHS and social care staff? And we'll be talking just after the bottom of the hour to Jeremy Richardson, Chief Executive of the Four Seasons Healthcare Group, about what's going on in care homes, because that is really important. And then 11:46, we're going to be talking to Professor Sanjay Sharma, the top sports cardiologist. It's Tice Talk, it's Talk Radio.
Good talk. Hot talk.
Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Bold, brave, ballsy.
Made to make your mouth water.
A radiant force of argument. Shape up and talk.
Freedom of speech. Accept no substitutes. Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk this Sunday morning, and I feel better. I feel optimistic. I feel brighter. The weather is brighter, and the news is brighter. We've just been listening to a man who knows, the Chief Executive of the British Ports Association, about actually the Brexit electronic declarations, not paperwork. No, electronic. Yes, we're into the 21st century. Paperwork is working well. So we've got good news there, and we've got potentially a U-turn on cladding. And there was a message here. Stephen, he also feels a bit more optimistic. He said, Elizabeth, spot on, brilliant call. The optimism in this morning is giving him a big lift. Mitch says, lots of common sense from Sir Peter Bottomley, who he wants to be Prime Minister. Well, there we are. I wonder if Sir Peter is still listening. He says, too many property developers are also party donors, which is possibly why buildings kept going up during the lockdowns. Actually, I don't think that is the reason, to be honest, Mitch. They kept going up because it was safe to do so on construction sites. And there's a balance, isn't there? We have to keep the economy going because, guess what? A healthy economy leads to healthier people. And a sick economy leads to sicker people, leading shorter lives. So lots of tweets and messages coming in. We've got Susie in Stoke Newington. Good morning to you, Susie. Are you feeling brighter, Susie?
Well, I am from listening to your programme, actually, rather than Radio 4 yesterday on any questions or any answers. I totally agree with that. The vaccine shouldn't be made mandatory for anyone. And I thought your clip from the doctor was really, really good, what he was saying. And there's so many more things to say about it like that, lots of people know, but they just don't get a chance to say it.
Well, and I think hearing it from someone who's on the front line, who knows what he's talking about, and he's made that personal judgment for him.
Well, he knows more than most people, and one reason, he obviously didn't go into why he didn't want the vaccine, but lots of people don't want the vaccine because they've researched it, they've seen other doctors who are epidemiologists and everything explain about what's happening with the vaccine, and there's lots of recorded side effects, there's lots of recorded deaths, and they reckon it's a lot more because they don't, about hundreds actually get recorded.
And in a sense, we know with medication, any form of medication, there can be side effects, and in a sense, that's no different whether it's paracetamol or whatever. And unless you're a doctor, I'm not. But there we had it from a doctor, and what he said, what I thought was fascinating, wasn't it? That he'd had COVID and he'd looked at antibodies.
Yes.
And lots of people are questioning that. And I think this debate, the great thing is that he felt able to have that discussion in front of the cameras.
Well, no, and I'm really grateful to your programme for that, I'll say, because yesterday I actually rang Any Answers, and by the end of it I said, I know you won't put me on because I've rung about 3 times before, and by the time I've said what I've said, I know they won't, and they didn't have one person on there who hadn't been vaccinated. They asked me if I hadn't been vaccinated, and I actually, because of the atmosphere, because the question was, do you think it's time for the unvaccinated, to make life unbearable for the unvaccinated? So, would you answer that question if someone asked you it, and actually they didn't, but then I said something that, I haven't been vaccinated for health reasons because I know what the vaccine could possibly do to me, and I've had experience of that before with drugs and things.
And of course, and that's why, Susie, everyone has to make their own personal judgments. They look at the data.
Yeah, and what I'd like to suggest, that just say 2 things. One is that doctor was right, and I read a study from Israel in September that said that if you've had COVID, you've got 13.5 times the immunity if you're under 60, and 2.5 times the immunity if you're over 60 of probably vaccine. The vaccine immunity isn't the same, and it's not going to give you the same immunity as actually any doctor will tell you. Having had COVID is the best protection ever. So when they stop people and young people getting it, that's always how, and I've heard scientists talk about this, that's always how you've protected people like in the past, like older people, that it reduces the effect of the virus. So when older people get it, they're less likely to die, or not necessarily older, but weaker people.
There was an interesting observation, Susie, this morning from a doctor earlier on Talk Radio who said, and it was quite interesting, that actually Omicron itself is effectively like a vaccine. It's going through
no,
the whole
it is.
population
Absolutely,
and giving people antibodies. Susie,
it's how we go. I just want to say one thing. One thing I would suggest for the whole situation around COVID is that groups that they know are likely at risk, people often with very low vitamin D, that they could be giving blood tests for vitamins and minerals, and that way it would not only improve their whole health and make them much less susceptible to anything, but on chronic things, everything. But it would also allow people to realise they wouldn't die if they've got all their vitamins and minerals in the right place. They're not likely to die from COVID.
Well, Susie, obviously, the key thing is, I'm not a doctor, and I don't think you are. We can't advise people what to do. That's, in a sense, that's not what a radio station for. What we can do is say, we know, for example, the Great Barrington Declaration was about protecting the vulnerable, and vulnerable people or those with medical conditions will, of course, be advised, always seek help from your doctor, from your physician or whatever. Susie, thank you so much for that call. We've got Terry, I think, in St Helens. Hi, Terry.
Hi, Richard.
How are we getting on this morning? Is it bright with you as well?
It is bright. After seeing that clip of the doctor challenging the health minister in the hospital, that's cheered me up fantastically because, to be honest, I've received nothing but abuse and been treated as a leper because I won't have the vaccine for the same reason, because of the antibodies that I've got.
Have you yourself had COVID, Terry, at some point?
Yes, and I've had the antibody check, and then I decided that I wouldn't have the vaccine.
So you made your own personal decision?
Yes, but even my own family's been saying to me, "Oh no, we don't want contact with you if you've not had the vaccines." And I've got other reasons as well that I don't trust the vaccines.
In a sense, that's the point about personal choice. You look at the information, and there's no question. The data clearly shows that the vaccines have dramatically reduced hospitalizations, reduced the severity of illness, particularly with the previous variants, and mercifully reduced deaths. But there are people and who've decided for their own reasons that they don't feel that they need the vaccine.
Well, I was listening to the previous show with Christo, and he had James. I forgot his second name, but he was giving you some data. And the data that he was giving, he was commenting saying that these figures will be shown when Chris Whitty comes out and gives his figures from Downing Street. And that's what we need. We need the truth and not things hiding.
Well, we certainly, hopefully you were interested if you were listening to the statistics from Jamie Jenkins, who used to work on health stats at the ONS.
That's him, yeah, very good, excellent. But that's what we want. We want the data. Then we can make then the nation can make a judged decision instead of being told one thing, which is one set of data which suits the narrative, and the other set of data, because it doesn't suit the narrative, we don't want to show us that.
It's about context, and it's about being open and transparent and informative. And then what happens is people will actually gain more trust in the information that we're given. It's when you're given one side of the data that, with, as you say, Terry, with a particular narrative, and then you discover a day or two later, through whatever means, through the newspapers, whatever, that the data they gave out was outdated, was old, was wrong, didn't set it in context. You lose trust, and trust in government and our leaders is critical, isn't it, Terry?
Yes, we should have trust, but I don't think people have got trust. I wanted to say as well that there's endless sources on the internet where you can do this research, and of course there's some nutters that get on and give stupid things out. But if you look at the credited people and the credited websites, there is the alternative view, like the guy we were talking about who was giving the data out on Christo's show. That it's there and it's available, but it's not given out to us at these meetings by Chris Whitty. And I think it's like a legal court case. You've got to go through a discovery period, which means you've got to release all the information and all the data so the jury can make their mind up.
You're absolutely right, Terry.
If the jury just listens to the prosecution, then there the jury can't form an opinion, and
Well,
we're in that position. We can't form an opinion.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's important that juries do get all the information and then that actually they make a proper judgment. Don't get me started this morning on juries. That might make me a bit gloomy after the Colston jury. But Terry, thank you very much. That was Terry in St Helens. He's feeling brighter this morning. John in East Anglia, are you feeling brighter this morning?
I'm okay, Richard. I had to call in and comment. I've been listening to talk radio again all morning, same as I do every day. We get fed constant lies and obfuscation.
What in particular is winding you up about that, John, and what can we do about it to feel brighter?
My lady is Asian, okay? She's a Filipino. And I'll often speak to her because she's living over there still at the moment. She's out on the outside of Britain looking in, okay? And they've got Omicron over there. They've got tons of Omicron. She's just had it. Both her adult sons have had it, her young adult sons, and her nephew who lives with her, he's 8, he's had it. They've all got asthma, Richard. 2 of them use nebulizers, you know,
yes.
Quite bad asthma. They felt rough for a couple of days. Then they're recovering now, fine, no problems. And at the same time, they had a vaccination, but they only got the Chinese, the Sinovac.
Oh, yes.
Which isn't particularly efficient.
That's what I've read. I can't actually vouch for it, but lots of people have indicated that. That's right.
Well, she's saying over there, they live in large communities, Richard, huge cities over there. Manila dwarfs London.
It does.
They all live in close proximity to each other. There's loads of them had it. Very few are dying. And within a few days, they're literally all just getting back on their feet and trying to make a go again.
Well, as we know, John, essentially Omicron has, it's got into most countries, many people's, and it's incredibly transmissible. But most people, I say most, not everybody, are receiving a sort of a mild effects of it. But some people are, of course, receiving, more serious effects. John, thank you so much for your thoughts in East Anglia and also what's going on out in the Philippines with Omicron. Coming up, we're going to be talking to Jeremy Richardson, Chief Executive of the Four Seasons Healthcare Group, about what's going on in care homes, the impact on staffing and COVID. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
With your headlines, I'm Nadira Tudor. The government insists free lateral flow tests for the public will continue, despite leaks suggesting they'll be scaled back. The Djokovic drama continues. Australia loses a bid to delay the tennis world #1's visa hearing. And England secure a draw in a dramatic end to the 4th Ashes Test against Australia. The Education Secretary says the government has no plans to scale back free lateral flow tests to high-risk settings. It comes after a report in the Sunday Times claimed that free tests would only be made available to essential workers. Nadeem Zahawi has also become the first cabinet minister to come out in support of cutting isolation to 5 days. The Australian government has failed in a bid to delay Novak Djokovic's visa hearing until after the Australian Open draw is finalised. His legal team claim he was sleep-deprived and pressured by officials to cancel his visa after being detained at Melbourne Airport. The case will be heard in a court tomorrow.
I think if it's our rule, it's our rule. That's it. No jab, no pray.
The decision's definitely a tough one to make, but in my opinion, I'd side with the Australian court and kick him out of the country.
I've just flown in from New Zealand and, I suppose the rules were pretty clear in terms of what you needed to provide with coming into Victoria. A no-fly zone could be placed over Windsor Castle following an incident involving a man with a bow and arrow on Christmas Day. The Met Police say they've applied for a restricted airspace order to prevent aircraft from flying up to 2,500 feet above the royal residence. And England have secured a draw in a dramatic end to the 4th Ashes Test against Australia. They battered out the final day in Sydney, finishing on 270 for 9. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Richard Tice on Talk Radio.
A first magnitude star of common sense.
The Tice Man.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk on this bright, cheery morning where the news so far has been optimistic, it's been bright. We think change is in the air, but we need to keep digging into what's going on in different parts of our country, different industries, and in particular with regard to health and care, what's going on in the social care industry, social care homes, because it's really, really important. And therefore I'm delighted to be joined once again, back by popular demand from my listeners and viewers when he was first on exclusively back in early December, I think it was. One was so optimistic, he said Jeremy Richardson for Prime Minister. But Jeremy, you are Chief Exec of the Four Seasons Healthcare Group. Thank you so much for joining us again this Sunday morning. Great to see you. And I just thought it'd be really interesting, Jeremy, to sort of get your sort of update, catch up on where things are now for you in the social care sector. Obviously, you're looking after your group, hundreds of homes, but you'll know what's going on elsewhere. And in particular, how serious the staffing crisis is.
Morning, Richard. Well, it's really nice to be with you again. And let me start by giving you some data, and I'll try and express it as clearly as Jamie Jenkins did earlier on for your listeners and for your viewers. So in the context of COVID, it's not going to surprise you if I tell you that the position in relation to deaths and the safety of our residents is very little changed from last time I was on your programme. So last time I was on, we'd had 132 deaths in the previous 2 weeks, of which one had been from COVID, so that's 1.2%. In the 3 weeks since I've last been on your programme, we've had 196 deaths, of which 3 have been from COVID. And again, to give you context, that's still in total below the 4-year seasonal average. So our total number of deaths is running below the 4-year average, and COVID is only accounting for between 1.2 and 1.5% of all deaths.
So wow! So let's just pause on that. So COVID is accounting for less than 1.5% of deaths in your care homes, and you're below the 4-year average number of deaths.
Yeah, and we've been below that figure in total for the last 2 years. So if I look at the period from January 2020, so that's pre-pandemic, through to the end of 2021, so the 24 months, we had a negative number of excess deaths.
So you're below the number, and that's across the whole of the COVID period. I mean, that to me is extraordinary. You just need to sort of pause and let that sink in, and wonder why no one else says these figures.
Well, look, I think that's part of the picture. And the other question that you asked me, you know, the one thing that has changed since I last came on your programme is that the number of my team who are isolating has gone up from 134 to 565.
Wow.
So that's 5%, because I have 12,000 people in the workforce. 5% of the workforce are currently isolating as a consequence of the restrictions that are being imposed on the way that we have to operate under COVID.
And Jeremy, would you know of those 5% who are isolating, and that's a huge number, you said about 500 staff.
Yep.
How many of those would actually have, I presume, Omicron or possibly Delta, or are isolating for other reasons?
So about 100 of those people, they've all tested positive, but about 100 of them have no symptoms at all. And the other 460 have some symptoms, but most of those symptoms, Richard, are very minor. So they are coughs, colds, sniffles.
Right. Okay. So that clearly operationally, 5% is really significant, a lot more than before. And you've got the challenge also of obviously losing staff before Christmas. I think it was November time, if they weren't vaccinated.
Yeah, as I said to you previously, I am absolutely convinced now that the cure is worse than the disease. And if you think about the situation that faced the government when they decided, whether you agree or not, and by the way, I didn't, but if you consider the situation in front of them when they decided to mandate the vaccine, that situation has fundamentally changed. So the risk presented from the virus now is dramatically different to what it was in March 2021. The virus, in effect, has evolved, but the government response hasn't. And I think it would be very sensible of them if they reconsider the facts as they were today and changed their policy accordingly. So I know there's a debate at the moment about mandating of the vaccine in the NHS, and there are some strong views on that. I'm not convinced that there would be any benefit of mandating the vaccine in the NHS. But then again, You know, the NHS and social care are two parts of the same system. So if you decide to defer or delay or even cancel mandatory vaccinations in the NHS, you have to do the same thing in social care. It makes no sense to have one policy in one part of the sector, another policy in the other half, and two wrongs don't make a right.
Absolutely. And what else would you like the government to change? I mean, my Sunday sermon, I was talking about changes in the air, and I'm sure that there's some other change you'd like to see the government listen to you on.
Yeah, and I think I've got four key asks of the government. So the first would be redefine what constitutes an outbreak of COVID in a care home. At the moment, it's 2 cases or more. I would argue that it should be a significantly higher number than that. That would be the first. The second is reduce the period for which a care home has to lock down if there's a COVID outbreak. Now, that was adjusted on Friday from 28 days to 14, but I would go further. I think that could be reduced to 7 days. The third thing I would ask is that they reduce the isolation period for team members who are testing positive for COVID. So currently 7 days. Nadeem Zahawi, I think, indicated earlier today that that might go to 5. Again, I'd be braver and go to 3. And for those members of the team who are asymptomatic, they're not showing any symptoms at all, then I would say there's no need to isolate at all, because, you know, after all, we have forced through a vaccine mandate on our teams. Everybody is double jabbed. Most people are boosted. All of our residents are double jabbed and boosted. So therefore, what's the dividend to the sector of having gone through that process? So that would be the third. And then I think my fourth plea to them would be stop the mass testing. You know, I'm not convinced that the continual testing of healthy people is a healthy thing in itself. And all it's doing is creating the problems that you and I have just talked about in the last few minutes.
Well, that's absolutely fascinating, Jeremy. And interestingly, earlier this week, I had Dr. Clive Dix on, who was the former chair of the Vaccine Task Force. And he actually went even slightly further. He said that we had now to have the courage to treat COVID like flu, and that you should stop all testing, because if you know you've got symptoms, if you feel rough, and you know we've all had flu in the past, then yes, of course, you do the common sense thing, which is stay at home, stay away until you don't. But he said, like you, that we shouldn't be testing healthy people. And it feels to me, as more and more people are brave enough to stand up and call for that this debate is going to move quite quickly, potentially.
Yeah, look, I agree with him completely, Richard. I see no need to continue to mass test people. In fact, I think by doing so, all you're doing is compounding the problem. You're exacerbating the issue that you're trying to solve. And I don't see how we ever get out of this unless we start to properly live with COVID. And it won't surprise you if I tell you that we've had no winter flu in our care homes this year. We didn't have any in 2019. We didn't have any in 2020. We've had none thus far in 2021. And I can be really confident in telling you that in the early part of 2022, we won't see any either, because COVID is the dominant virus, and you won't see a conflation of two dominant viruses at the same time.
So COVID is the dominant virus, and yet less than 1.5% of deaths in your care homes. Every death is sad, but it's almost the only certainty in life eventually. But less than 1.5% are COVID related, and therefore, in a sense, that must be similar to your flu figures.
Yeah, and I think you've touched on a really interesting point there, where you talk about the way that we treat death. And, you know, I operate in a business where death is part of our business every day. And you're quite right to say that every death is sad. There's a family, there are relatives, there are emotions, there are sentiments involved. And so every death is a sad death, but not every death is a tragedy. And some of the language that I think government and some of our policymakers are using at the moment is deeply unhelpful. The sensationalist language around tragedy and war and battle and victims isn't helping us move this debate forward, because you're right, you know, every death is not a tragedy. People who pass away in their 90s or even in their early hundreds are not being deprived of large numbers of years of life. And we need to look at that honestly and have a proper debate if we're going to move this forward.
It's all about context, is it? And reminding people that actually, sadly, give or take 1,600 to 1,700 people in the UK do die every day throughout the whole year. That's as an average. In winter, it's actually even higher than that. And if people understood the context, I think they'd have more understanding of the overall situation.
So I've argued passionately right from the early days of this pandemic that the one thing we need to think about is managing with context and proportionality. And the second thing I'd say is thinking about risk. You need to measure up the relative risk. So what is the risk presented by the virus itself? and that's the risk of transmission. But the relative risk relates to the consequence of transmission. So if the consequence of transmission is dramatically different, really not terribly dangerous, then you need to start thinking about the other relative risks. So in my case, lack of team and all of the challenges that go with that, because I'm very clear that presents more of a problem for the country and has much greater impact on the quality of life that we're able to give our residents than the risk from the virus itself. And the policy and the decision making must be driven by that and a more holistic approach than simply continuing to focus on one issue, which is COVID.
That's right. Jeremy, thank you so much indeed. I've really enjoyed that. And so have my listeners and viewers, Jeremy, because we've got messages coming in. Great hearing to a real expert from one, and another one saying great again from your guest, Jeremy. That was from Jane. That was Jeremy Richardson, Chief Executive of the Four Seasons Healthcare Group, giving his update 5 or 6 weeks after he was last on what's really going on in the care home sector. And my goodness me, I wish that he was standing alongside the Prime Minister, giving the context, the reality of what's really happening in care homes. People would have much more confidence, much more optimism. That was Jeremy Richardson. Stay with me. Coming up after the break, we've got the big interview, the exclusive interview, the first time ever. Professor Sanjay Sharma, top sports cardiologist, talking about what's going on with elite sportsmen, footballers, following my interview last week with Matt Letizia. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
A new lineup for a new generation.
Essential, edgy, engaging.
Advanced postulation for any angry nation.
Ask for it by name.
Talk Radio.
The home of common sense.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. We're in the second hour of this 3-hour show, and I'm delighted now that we're going to talk about an important issue that people have been seeing in social media and stuff. And you'll recall last week I had a chat with Matt Le Tissier about, and he was obviously a former well-known international football player for Southampton and England in the 90s and early 2000s. And he was essentially recalling he doesn't remember when he was a pro, footballers struggling with some chest pains and collapsing in the same way that perhaps people have seen on social media and heard about in this current season and over the summer. And that gave me the opportunity to invite my next guest, Professor Sanjay Sharma, who is a top sports cardiologist and advisor to many Premier League football clubs and indeed the FA and the Rugby League. Sanjay, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. We really do appreciate it here on Talk Radio. The first time I think you've been on. A very warm welcome to you. So I think you heard Matt Le Tissier with his comments there. And I guess, in a sense, the real question, my first sort of question to you is, in your experience, and you've obviously been involved for a very long time, do you recognise those comments from Matt that maybe for whatever reason there are more elite sportsmen, athletes who have been struggling with chest pains, with cardiac issues than perhaps 20 or 25 years ago?
Certainly what we've witnessed over the last month would suggest that these potential cardiac events in sport could be on the increase, and this is really highlighted by some very high-profile events, probably the most high-profile events that I've ever recognised or realised, Ericsson being one of them in August, and then, of course, the scare that happened to Aguero. So when you get two very high-profile individuals being affected, and you get reports coming in from some of our local football players, such as Fleck and White, people start to worry, why is there this sudden rise? We're in a pandemic, and people start putting one and one together and come up with a slightly different equation and attribute all of this to COVID or even, vaccinations, as you may have heard in the media. So I hope I'm going to be able to sort of shed some light on what we think's going on. As far as the FA goes, clearly the research that's going on really is targeted on public health issues, that is to determine how many of these football players have been vaccinated against COVID and how many football players have actually tested positive for COVID. So that we've got that sort of information. We know that around 1 in 5 football players get infected with COVID, and we know that around 68% of players have been doubly jabbed and around 25% have refused to be jabbed. But I have not been able to identify any obvious link between COVID and the vaccine and any of the cardiac events that have been reported in the media so far.
And that's very helpful indeed. And that 68% figure of footballers who've been vaccinated, I think I'm right in saying that's very similar to the percentage of males in the age range of give or take 20 to 30.
Correct. So it's no different to that of the general population, just under 75%.
Yeah. Okay. So that's helpful. And about 1 in 5 had COVID. So in terms of the research that the FA is doing and presumably collating from, I guess, not just Premier League clubs, but across the whole of all of the various divisions of the football leagues, what exactly are they collating in terms of data? And are they going to then release that as on a sort of interim, ongoing basis?
I think when it comes to the FA are really looking at the public health side of things, looking really at how many football players have had COVID and how many people have been vaccinated or how many have been tested positive. So that's what their aim is. But we do have at the FA a very large cardiac screening program that's been in place since 1997. And we also have a cardiac consensus panel that consists of 12 experts that are responsible for the cardiac health of all of these football players. So what we do have is individual doctors collating data, which we hope to pool to come up with something. I can already tell you from my own personal experience in representing myself today is that I look after about 11 clubs and I've got other colleagues that look after 10 or 11. And we have certainly pooled data, a few of us, to give us some information, and I can certainly give you that around 1 in 20 football players get COVID. We have the advantage of actually having serial assessments in these individuals. For example, we know player X had an ECG in 2017, 2018, and then has another one in 2021 following COVID. We find that the ECGs change in around 3% of these football players after they've developed COVID.
And for my listeners, Sanjay, an ECG is?
So an ECG is an electrical tracing of the heart that looks at the electrical heart rhythm, but can also give you some idea whether there's a structural problem with the heart. So football players normally get these done routinely, but with COVID and fears about COVID causing cardiac involvement, and many Premier League clubs at least are performing ECGs on all their players after COVID infection. So within 7 to 10 days when they're out of isolation, they get these tests. And what we're finding is around 3% of these football players are showing changes on their ECG compared to previously. And when we investigate that small number, that 3%, we find that about 4/5 reveal some form of cardiac inflammation, either affecting the heart muscle itself or the coating of the heart muscle called the pericardium.
So that's about 4/5 of the 3% you're seeing some change post-COVID. And
about 2.4%, yes.
Okay, and so that's sort of within 7 to 10 days. And are they then re-looking at it a number of months later to see how long that may endure?
Of course. So what happens is that if you diagnose something called myocarditis, which is another name for inflammation of the heart muscle, clearly when a football player is diagnosed with something like this, that's of concern to the club and to all of us, because if you exercise with an inflamed heart, particularly if you exercise at the level that these football players do, this can result in scarring of the heart, weakness of the heart muscle, or even cause cardiac rhythm disturbances. So these people, once they're diagnosed with something like that, really have to rest from sport for between 6 to 3 months and must have a repeat evaluation after 3 months, which includes an MRI scan, which continues to look for inflammation, but they also have exercise tests and various other tests, and they can only go back and start playing again if the heart function is good. There is no evidence of abnormal rhythm disturbances during exercise, and when the inflammation has completely subsided.
And in terms of the 68%, give or take, who have been vaccinated, who may be within that 3%, are you seeing any trends in that relative to having COVID? Or relative to those who essentially haven't had COVID and haven't had the vaccine at all?
No, in fact, because the number is very small, this 2.4% in whom we're identifying something, we have found that a lot of these things that we detected was early on, before the vaccine. So my personal feeling is that the vaccine is actually protecting some of these football players from COVID. I mean, the chances of, I've already said to you, the chance of an athlete getting COVID, certainly in football, is 1 in 5. The chance of them then getting inflammation of the heart muscle, if we look at the general population of athletes in the world, is about 1 in 200. So the chance of you actually getting COVID that affects the heart muscle, if we look at the whole sporting population, is about 1 in 1,000. So if we actually look at the risk of vaccinations, that we know that vaccinations can cause inflammation of the heart, i.e. myocarditis. The risk of myocarditis after vaccination is between 1 in 20,000 and 1 in 50,000. So I haven't been able to link inflammation of the heart to a vaccination thus far, but that's not surprising when one considers that the incidence of such a risk is so low.
Right. So in a sense, 1 in 1,000 COVID cases might have some form of myocarditis, but obviously, therefore, in a sense, the footballers that you're seeing, that's not that huge a number, and therefore you're not seeing a trend so far.
Not so far. I think we'll have to wait. And obviously, with Omicron around, the number of football teams that are going down, and you've seen from postponement of so many football games, the number of individuals being infected for the second time or third time is now going up. And I think we'll have to wait for a few months before I can, present you any more detailed information about the sequelae. But what I can tell you is that many of the football players that have been infected recently, that have led to postponement of games, have actually been double jabbed.
That's fascinating. Well, Sanjay, thank you so much for these thoughts. And I think it'd be great if you could come back with an update in a few weeks' time or a couple of months' time as we get a bit more data, because people obviously are concerned. There have tragically been indeed heart attacks and deaths on pitch, which in a sense is ongoing. So it is an ongoing concern. It's great to have your ongoing views as such an experienced sports cardiologist. Sanjay, thank you very much indeed. And that, ladies and gentlemen, was Professor Sanjay Sharma, top sports cardiologist who advises 11 Premier League clubs and the Football Association with his thoughts on what's going on with COVID, with cardiology, with the heart, and we'll try and get him back in some months to come. Stay with us into the third hour. It's Tice Talk. It is Talk Radio.
Good talk. Hot talk.
Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Live at 12, I'm Nadira Tudor. The government insists free lateral flow tests for the public will continue despite leaks suggesting they'll be scaled back. The Djokovic drama continues. Australia loses a bid to delay the tennis world number one's visa hearing. And England secure a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. The Education Secretary says the government has no plans to scale back free lateral flow tests to high-risk settings. It comes after a report in the Sunday Times claimed that free tests would only be made available to essential workers. Nadeem Zahawi has also become the first cabinet minister to come out in support of cutting isolation to 5 days. A surge in Omicron cases has led to staff shortages in various sectors.
If the experts, and I have to defer to the UK Health and Security Agency, deem it appropriate that you can have 2 negative tests on consecutive days, as we do now with day 6 and 7, then it's a good thing to keep under review, and that's exactly what they're doing.
7 people have died and 9 others have been seriously hurt after a slab of rock broke off a cliff in Brazil and hit pleasure boaters near a waterfall below. At least 2 vessels were hit in the incident between the towns of São José da Barra and Capitolio. 3 people are still missing. The local fire department has now deployed divers and helicopters to help locate those who cannot be found. Court documents claim that Novak Djokovic was not told that his medical exemption would allow him to enter the country for the Australian Open. The world tennis number one's lawyers say he was given a medical exemption after testing positive for COVID on the 16th of December. The case will be heard in court tomorrow after the government lost a bid to delay it until Wednesday. A baby that was handed over a fence at Kabul airport during the chaos of evacuations has finally been reunited with his family. 2-month-old Sahil Ahmadi was passed to an American soldier when the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in August. A no-fly zone could be placed over Windsor Castle following an incident involving a man with a bow and arrow on Christmas Day. The Met Police say they've applied for a restricted airspace order to prevent aircraft from flying up to 2,500 feet above and 1.5 nautical miles around the royal residence. And England have secured a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes Test against Australia. They battered out the final day in Sydney, finishing on 270 for 9. Stuart Broad and James Anderson saw out the final 2 overs to avoid going 4-0 down in the series. And your weather, showers for those in the north and west today, but mostly fine and dry elsewhere. Cloudier later with a chance of fog for some, highs of 7 degrees. That's your live news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Sunday Talk.
Good talk. News talk.
Talk Radio.
The Tice Man cometh.
Stir up your Sundays with Richard Tice.
From global current affairs to the issues that hit closer to home.
Richard Tice.
On Talk Radio.
Good afternoon and welcome back to Tice Talk. We're into the third and final hour of the show, and we've just been having an exclusive discussion with the top sports cardiologist, Professor Sanjay Sharma, who advises about 11 Premier League clubs and the FA and Rugby League, on his thoughts on what's going on with COVID, with the vaccine and elite sportsmen. And what he was clearly saying is that actually cardiologists advising various clubs, they are pooling information to look at what's going on, to look at data. The FA is doing research which is ongoing. He says it looks like footballers, about the same percentage of footballers, give or take 70%, are vaccinated relative to young men of the sort of 20 to 30 age group. So that's a sort of normal percentage. And he's saying that about 1 in 20 may have had COVID. And of course, being elite sportsmen, many of them have had ECGs over a number of years. So they've got ongoing data. And they're seeing, I think, if I've got this right, he's seeing about a 3% of those who get COVID, which is 1 in 5, may see some form of change. And in a sense, that's obviously what they're continuing to monitor. But his view clearly is that that's as a result of COVID, not as a result of the vaccine, those who've been vaccinated. But clearly they're monitoring that research, keeping it going. And the great news is that he will come back on this show and talk to me in a couple of months' time with a further update on what they're seeing. And it's understandable people are concerned because, lots of us watch social media, we hear stuff, we see stuff all over the world, which of course didn't happen 20 or 30 years ago. But that was great, that interview with Sanjay, and I'm deeply grateful to him for coming on exclusively here on Talk Radio. Now, of course, other things are going on all over the world, and there's a big issue going on in Kazakhstan, where once again, Russia is imposing itself. And in a sense, you might say, why am I disappearing from sort of English football to Kazakhstan? Well, it's important. Kazakhstan is the largest Central Asian country. I think it's the largest landlocked country in the world. And it's one of the wealthiest in Central Asia. And we've got a situation, it's so big, it's the size of Western Europe. We forget that. It's very significant in terms of being very rich in rare earth minerals. It's got about 3% of global oil reserves, and it borders China and Russia. And they've had a people's sort of unrest and uprising in recent days, I think mainly triggered over a huge increase in fuel prices, but also in terms of who's actually running the country, because they recently re-elected a different president, President Tokayev, but it turns out the former president, President Nazarbayev, he still seems to be pulling the strings. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? President Putin. And Putin has now recently put in a few thousand paratroopers, and is delighted now to be joined by Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Special Correspondent for The Times, who writes about this frequently. There's an internet media blackout going on, and this is essentially a repressed regime. And once again, Russia is in the mix. Michael, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us.
Hello, yes.
And you've just written about this, Michael. So tell us, what's your take on what's going on and whether or not Russia, in a sense, wants to be causing once again, I call it mischief for want of a better word, but in the mix, or whether actually it's there slightly against its better judgment based on the issues it's got with Ukraine and Belarus?
Well, yes, it is a nightmare situation for Russia, really, because what they don't want is instability and violence on yet another of their neighbors' borders. I mean, as you say, Belarus and Ukraine already are in turmoil. Kazakhstan, for the past 30 years, has been a very steady, reliable, good neighbor. It's been quite repressive and repressed, but it is quite rich. And the former president was quite clever at balancing the forces between China, Russia, and quite a lot of Western investment. Now that all seems to be going wrong. I think Russia is intervening simply to stamp it out or help stamp it out as quickly as possible, even quite ruthlessly. They don't really want to get involved, but they could see that if it just gets out of control, there could be all kinds of chaos.
And it seems a bit odd that they're rich in oil reserves and they've got a lot of gas as well, and yet their energy prices, I think they've effectively doubled.
Yes, indeed, and that's what triggered the unrest. They use liquid gas for powering cars mainly, and it was kept artificially cheap, I mean below market rate, which is not sensible for any economy. So they put the prices up, but that really just triggered another sort of discontent, which is the feeling that the present government, even though they've changed the president, it's still the same people, have been there too long, and it's time for a change. And I have to say that the Islamists and the nationalists in Kazakhstan, who've more or less been kept under control up till now, suddenly saw a chance, which is very dangerous for Russia, because there's a 3.5 million Russian minority living in Kazakhstan, and it could turn into a nasty ethnic conflict.
So that's a Russian minority, but obviously, nevertheless, 3.5 million Russians, very significant. So, but is it possible actually, in the alternative, Michael, that once again Putin has the ability, with a modest number of Russian troops, to flex his muscles, to show that ultimately he's not in charge per se, but very, very influential in another huge Central Asian state?
Oh, yes, I think that's a very important message. It's to show that Russia will immediately do something if there's trouble next door. And also it's a message to China, because there is this kind of strategic competition between Russia and China for influence in Kazakhstan. Up till now, Kazakhstan's tended to tilt a bit more towards Russia politically, but of course, economically, the Chinese are very active there. So the Russians are more or less saying, this is our backyard, we will help solve this problem. And they've invoked the help of the sort of Russian equivalent of NATO, which is a common defense union with several of the other former republics. So it's not just Russian troops, but of course, they're the dominant ones that have gone in, and it's Russia calling the shots.
And of course, it's actually Russia that wants to send its gas to China to boost its economy rather than Kazakhstan. So I can see that, because there's also talk about Russia building new pipelines into China that just avoid Kazakhstan.
Absolutely. They need to sell their gas to someone. And of course, they're having a bit of a row with the Europeans at the moment and deliberately keeping gas supplies low. They do need to sell it to China. China is desperate for energy. It could come either from Russia or from Kazakhstan or from both. But of course, the Russians don't really want too much competition for their gas. And the pipelines, as you say, are being built right across these vast stretches of land to reach China.
And I guess we're also hearing a lot about Russia massing its troops on the border with Ukraine, where it's another energy-related issue, isn't it? In that Russia clearly wants the pipeline direct to Germany, Nord Stream 2, opened. It wants to make sure Ukraine doesn't get any closer to NATO. And once again, Putin is playing massive geopolitics with the West and with other states on its borders.
Yes, absolutely. As you say, the key thing for Putin is that NATO shouldn't have any further influence in Ukraine. In fact, they don't want any influence at all. They would like the West to withdraw all the military help it's given to Ukraine and more or less acknowledge that this is Russia's backyard and nothing to do with NATO. In fact, that probably is the case. There's no appetite at all to admit Ukraine to NATO, but NATO obviously can't say that. They can't openly say, okay, it's your area, because that would be more or less an acknowledgement that other countries have a veto over what goes on in Ukraine, which wouldn't be acceptable. But yeah, that is the worry, massing these troops there, trying to keep up the tension with the West as a way of trying to ensure that the West doesn't encroach any further. And gas is obviously another tool that the Russians can use to make their influence felt.
And do you think that actually Putin does want to encroach, invade possibly the east of Ukraine for a variety of strategic reasons? Or do you think that this is just pure negotiating leverage to get Nord Stream 2 open and, in a sense, to try and keep gas prices high?
Well, I don't think the Ukraine situation is directly linked to the Nord Stream thing. The Nord Stream issue, which is, you say, very important for Russia to export its gas, is more directly linked to the Russians actually reducing supplies of gas at a critical time for the West when, you know, winter is here and prices are high. The Ukraine thing is more fundamental and really has little to do directly with the gas, although the pipelines do go through Ukraine. I think the Russians certainly would like to support fellow Russian speakers in Ukraine. The country is pretty much divided between East and West. I mean, the eastern part is very close to Russia ethnically, and the religion is the same, and in many ways the history is the same. And the Russians do feel that, you know, they're kindred folk. They have a duty to support them. I don't think they want to take over that part of Ukraine. It would be very expensive. They certainly wanted to take over Crimea because that's traditionally always been Russian territory. What they would like is to make sure that these two rebel republics more or less are autonomous and can have close links with Russia without the Ukrainians cracking down on them.
Indeed. So essentially what we're seeing is Putin once again is just exerting his influence, keeping everybody on his borders on their toes. And as you say, he's obviously got a sizable Russian population in Ukraine, and I think it's approaching 20% Russians in Kazakhstan. And he wants to make sure that in Kazakhstan's case, he doesn't want China to get more dominant. In the Ukraine's case, he doesn't want the West to get more dominant.
Absolutely, that's very much the case. I mean, the Russians have always referred to their former Soviet republics, once part of the whole, you know, Soviet Union, as the near abroad. In other words, it's not really abroad. It's what used to be part of our country. And they feel that that must remain the case, that they should have a dominant say in what goes on just across their borders. And these are the messages being sent to all those around them. The one area that they can't really influence in the same way are the Baltic republics, which more or less escaped from Russian domination right at the start when the Soviet Union collapsed and are now firmly fixed within NATO and within the EU. But they're very small. And although there's a Russian population there, they are quite small and not strategically significant in the same way.
Indeed, whereas obviously Ukraine and Kazakhstan clearly are strategically significant. Michael, thank you so much for that update. It's obviously a fast-moving situation in Kazakhstan, as it is potentially in the Ukraine. That was Michael Binion, Foreign Affairs Specialist for The Times, with an update of what's going on in Central Asia. It may feel a long way away, but actually it is really important, and we need to know what is going on, what is the objective, and what's the implications for us, because we know, in the same way that energy prices have doubled in Kazakhstan, give or take, guess what? They're doubling, give or take, energy prices here in the UK, and that's of massive, massive concern. We'll be talking about that later and ongoing. Stay with us. Coming up, we'll take your calls, 0344 499 1000. Give us a call, your views about mandating vaccinations, about what Sanjay Sharma, the professor, was saying about cardiology amongst footballers, or anything else. Don't hesitate. Give us a call. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
Talk Radio.
Radio where you can let off some steam. Reason re-engineered.
We think what you think.
Smart speaker, smart TV.
Deadly accurate debate. Talk first, talk fast.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk here on Talk Radio. It is well into the third hour and we've had some great guests. We've had Jeremy Richardson talking about social care and what's going on there, and his request that the government remove the need for social care staff to be vaccinated in the same way that is possibly going to be the big debate between now and April for NHS staff, and reminding us that just 1.2% of his sad deaths in his care homes are COVID related. That was fascinating. Tweets coming in regarding the discussion with Sanjay Sharma and the data that he was talking about. And in a sense, that data is ongoing, and we'll get him back to update us as to what's going on there. The good news is that there is clearly lots of data being collected on that. There are lots of people who've got concerns, and it's right that we should discuss those concerns, get the data so the evidence can be looked at and be put out there. Anyway, we've got now a couple of calls coming in. We've got John in Weston-super-Mare. Good afternoon, John. What's on your mind? How are you?
Hi, Richard. Yeah, great show. It's really a question for the professor from the FA. One of the easier comparisons that could be done, because we know COVID was really circulating in Q4 2019, and obviously all through 2020 without any vaccines. It would be very interesting to ask the question how these issues with sports players and football players could actually be compared with the 2021 when the vaccine was actually rolled out. I didn't feel from his answers he was actually really committed to putting a lot of resources into actually answering these questions as quick as he should be. And certainly some of the figures I've seen, a 500% increase of injuries in 2021, where it should be very easy to compare when COVID was circulating in 2020.
Indeed, or before 2020, in previous years when there was no COVID. Look, I think that he was pretty clear that there's a lot of work going on. They clearly are comparing the data. I felt from his answer he hadn't yet seen a link. They're obviously aware that people are talking about it, and I would think that as they come back to us, we'll get more updates on that. It should be, but I do know that on the big cases that have been talked about, the Ericssons, the Agueros, and then Charlie Wyke and things, that they had ruled out the vaccine being involved in that, and indeed I think the Sheffield United player John Fleck. So that's his view so far, but who knows, maybe that will be updated and maybe that will change, John.
Yes, no, I think so, because certainly when you look at there was a US Illinois insurance company where they were comparing since vaccine rollouts 1 year and the previous year, there was actually a 40% increase in 18 to 64-year-olds working age, unfortunately dying since the vaccine rollout in America. So I think there's quite a lot of statistics that could be gone through fairly quickly, fairly easily, and I think people need to be doing this. They're representing these sportsmen, and they need to be working on it as quickly as possible.
Well, I'm quite. One would expect, given that they advise these sports clubs and these teams and the individuals, the players, that they will be looking at this. And actually, it was quite reassuring to hear just how many scans they are doing of elite sportsmen's hearts every year, and indeed every few months, to see changes and to therefore learn about what's going on, which of course is probably very different to what was happening 15, 20 years ago, just because the quality of the scanning equipment, the diagnostics is so much greater. They'll have that much more information.
Yes, certainly. But he did mention ECGs, and I know from experience that ECGs are very snapshot. So therefore, 1 week an ECG can actually be quite fine, and another week or another fortnight, possibly after a virus, it can actually be affected quite dramatically. I'm sure he would be aware of that type of thing. But I just feel there's a lot more data that could be looked into, and I think it could be looked into much quicker than he seemed to be implying.
Well, I think that's the ongoing point that we've got to keep asking for, and ask the FA so that they produce the data. What he was saying about the FA is I think they're looking at it on a much wider basis as well, public health, not just elite footballers, but further down the, in a sense, further down the divisions, the leagues and the amateurs. Hopefully they're looking at that as well, because it is such a vital issue. John, thank you for that. I think we've got another John in Wolverhampton. Good afternoon, John.
Good afternoon there. I've got an issue with the way they announce how many people have died in the last week. When it comes on the BBC News, it says, for instance, 100 people have died after being tested positive for COVID in the last 28 who've died for any reason. So therefore then, if I was tested positive for COVID 3 weeks ago and I'm out in my car today and I have a crash and I get killed, it's COVID that's killed me, not the car crash, which is stupid.
You're absolutely right. That has been an ongoing issue. It is ridiculous. I don't know what percentage that relates to, mercifully, in terms of accidents like that, but it can be that extreme, John, and it does seem strange. As I understand, there's no overlay of common sense to say, well, if he's tragically had a car crash, he's died of a car crash, not of COVID.
That's right. I mean, if an healthy person catches COVID and unfortunately goes into hospital and unfortunately he dies, that's COVID that's killed him. But if the way I've explained it, if I get killed in a car crash, it's the car crash, not COVID.
That's right. And there are other issues in that regard as well. It's not just obviously car crashes, but I do think, as you say, the way they present the data it's always very one-sided. It doesn't present it within the context, does it?
It's almost as if they're trying to frighten us to think more people are actually dying from COVID than they actually are.
Well, I think it's, in a sense, we've all got our opinions, but there's no question that they've looked for compliance. They've looked for compliance in lockdowns, and I think, for many of them, they've actually rather enjoyed the control element. And for some, I think it's just been a case of just, in a sense, fearful themselves. But without doubt, what the net result of the way they've approached it has been, in my view, unnecessarily to scare and frighten large chunks of the population, which hasn't been the case in other countries.
I'm in total agreement with you. Total agreement.
Well, John, thank you very much for that. And just before you go, John, so what's your view on my key question, which is NHS staff and indeed social care staff, as we should consider them really as one in the healthcare sector? Should there be mandatory vaccines for them or not, John?
Yes, I think there should be, yes.
You think they should be mandatory vaccines for them?
Yes.
OK, that's interesting. And why do you think that, John?
Well, they're in the hospitals dealing with people who unfortunately have got COVID, and if they're injected, they're protected against it.
Well, in a sense, yes, they're protected. They protect themselves, but of course, as we know, and indeed was explained by that medic talking to the health secretary, we know that the vaccines do a great job in preventing severity of illness or death, but it doesn't stop transmission or reinfection.
But we need the nurses and the doctors to be in the hospital to save other people's lives.
We certainly do, but that if you then mandate it and you then lose tens of thousands of frontline staff, then you're achieving the exact opposite, aren't you?
I don't think you would lose tens of thousands. I think the common sense would prevail.
You think that it would have the effect that more people would then get the vaccine?
Yes.
Interesting. Well, certainly there's lots of views of that. A different range of views. Certainly Jeremy Richardson in the social care group, his business, I think almost 200 care homes. He doesn't want to mandate it because he's struggling to get his staff. But John, thank you so much for that. That was John in Wolverhampton. He does want mandatory vaccination of healthcare staff. Give us a ring, send us a message, your view on that. 0344 49000 Let me try that again. 0344 499 1000. Losing touch with the telephone number. What's going on? Stay with us. Coming up, we're going to be talking about Buy British. And the good news is, yes, we've got lots and lots and lots of lithium, British lithium in Cornwall. Don't go anywhere. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Online and on your smart TV. Talk Radio TV News.
Here are your headlines. I'm Nadira Tudor. The government insists free lateral flow tests for the public will continue despite leaks suggesting they'll be scaled back. And England secure a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. The Education Secretary says the government has no plans to scale back free lateral flow tests to high-risk settings. It comes after a report in the Sunday Times claimed that free tests would only be made available to essential workers. Nadeem Zahawi has also become the first cabinet minister to come out in support of cutting isolation to 5 days. A surge in Omicron cases has led to staff shortages in various sectors.
If the experts, and I have to defer to the UK Health and Security Agency, deem it appropriate that you can have 2 negative tests on consecutive days, as we do now with day 6 and 7, then it's a good thing to keep under review, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Court documents claim that Novak Djokovic was not told that his medical exemption would allow him to enter the country for the Australian Open. The world tennis number one's lawyers say he was given a medical exemption after testing positive for COVID on the 16th of December. The case will be heard in court tomorrow after the government lost a bid to delay it until Wednesday. A baby that was handed over a fence at Kabul airport during the chaos of evacuations has finally been reunited with his family. 2-month-old Sahil Ahmadi was passed to an American soldier when the Taliban took control of Afghanistan in August. And England have secured a draw in a dramatic end to the fourth Ashes test against Australia. They battered out the final day in Sydney, finishing on 270 for 9. Stuart Broad and James Anderson saw out the final 2 overs to avoid going 4-0 down in the series. That's your news on Talk Radio TV. More in half an hour.
Tice on Talk Radio. Common sense radio for common sense people.
Talk Radio. Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
Richard Tice. Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk, and we've had, hopefully you've enjoyed a good show so far. It's been bright, it's been cheery, and there's been lots of good news. We've been talking about change, we've been talking about positive news, a bit like the weather, bright, blue and cheery. And we've got some more good news for my final guest of the show, which is, I'm a great believer in buying British, making British, and being self-reliant. And that's particularly important as we look to move forwards and as we start to reduce emissions, which the UK has been doing quite successfully so far, and as the government is pushing a drive towards more electric cars. So yes, electric cars need batteries, and batteries need lithium. And lithium is absolutely critical. It's a very expensive mineral, and we need to reduce our dependency on China. And China's been producing a lot of batteries and controls a lot of lithium. But the good news, folks, is that actually, yes, there is lots of lithium here in the United Kingdom, down in Cornwall, which of course has a very long, rich history in mining all sorts of materials, tin, copper, and so it's in a sense steeped in those rare metals and minerals and things that are very useful. And so therefore, knowing that we've got our own lithium and that we can extract it and use it ourselves, I think is really important. So I'm delighted now to be joined this afternoon by Andrew Smith, Chief Executive of British Lithium, that is part of the drive to start extracting lithium here in the UK, in Cornwall. Andrew, a very good afternoon to you. Thanks for joining us on Tice Talk. So Andrew, tell us a bit about where you are in the stage of extracting lithium down in Cornwall, and how much there is potential each year, and for how many years, and what impact this may have on, for example, our automotive sector.
Well, I think just setting the scene, by 2030, the UK has effectively mandated that all vehicles in the UK must be electric. So our £84 billion auto industry has to transition to electric vehicles. This is going to create an unprecedented demand for raw elements and commodities such as lithium. And where are we going to get it from? China, Argentina? There's just simply not enough to go around. And we've got lithium in the rocks, particularly in Cornwall, but the challenge has been getting that out of the ground and doing that in an economic way, in an environmentally sustainable way. So we've spent a lot of time and effort, and we've built a pilot plant, which the UK government has given us some money towards. And late in December, the very first lithium carbonate came out the end of the plant.
That sounds fantastic. That sounds like a really defining moment. And so, if the trials are continuing to go well, what's the timescale from now to be able to produce it on a commercial scale that is then helping British industry?
Well, we're producing about 5 kilograms per day at the moment, which is just enough to get gigafactories interested and get offtake agreements. And the data we're getting from this pilot plant will enable us to put in an application to the council this year. So hopefully within 3 years' time, we'll be entering construction on the full-size plant. And we target production of about 20,000 tonnes a year. So that's enough for about 500,000 cars.
Wow, 20,000 tonnes. And so when do you think, assuming planning goes well, and from my experience, planning's always quite a challenge, quite a battle, but assuming that goes okay, then when do you think that you might be up to 21,000 tonnes?
I think we're going to be realistic on the planning and give it 3 years plus an 18-month construction window.
Okay, right. So that's call that 5 years. And just on the planning, I mean, obviously, as I said, Cornwall it's got lots of quarries. It's got that history in mining. What's the mood of the local people?
I think the mood has been very supportive. You know, like you mentioned, everyone in Cornwall has sort of some mining link. They understand mining. You know, it's not the Victorian era. It's not like we're sending people down shafts with a pick and an axe. It's just going to be a small open pit quarry, not too dissimilar to what is there now, with a little chemical plant on the side that takes that granite and produces lithium carbonate.
I mean, it feels very exciting to be. And what sort of number of jobs, Andrew, would that create, both direct and indirect?
Well, direct, our labour model is showing about 386 jobs.
Wow.
But the indirect multiplier is huge. It's about 8.2. You know, it require a lot of people, from chemists to laboratories to service provider, mechanics. So it is a huge windfall for the job industry of Cornwall. And in fact, if we attract a gigafactory down there, then we're looking at several thousand jobs.
Wow. So that is part of the potential, is to have a gigafactory down in Cornwall. I know that there's one planned up in the northeast.
I think that's something that the UK should be looking towards, is don't follow Australia where we just dig out commodities and sell them. We should really value add and go through the entire value chain, because the auto industry is hundreds of billions, and that's what we want to sustain.
Absolutely right, because you talk about your 20,000 tonnes or so being enough for batteries for, I think you said 500,000 cars. And I think pre-COVID, the UK was making just under 1 million cars here in the UK that were being bought and used in the UK. So that's a big, big contribution towards it.
Yeah, it's a serious dent in our supply capability, but we'll need others. You know, there's other companies exploring, and we wish them luck. And I think we all need to come together to support this growing and expanding and exciting industry.
And Andrew, what sort of support are you getting from the government at the moment, and in terms of potential incentives from the government in the future? Because clearly, you know, at a sort of, when you're investing new money in this sort of technology, it's the riskiest phase for investors. It's vital, you know, that you've got the government with you and behind you.
Absolutely. And starting with Innovate UK support that the government has given, that's been a good mandate and a good vote of confidence that's enabled us to attract other investment. But also, you know, it's been a long time since anyone's built a new mine in the UK. So it's trying to understand the rules. You know, we're not 100% sure. The government might not be 100% sure. So we are working with government quite closely about how a project like this would look and how it would plug into the national infrastructure.
That's absolutely vital, because my one anxiety, Andrew, would be the government's tried to promote, or in a sense, did promote a new shale gas industry elsewhere in England, and sort of pushed it all the way through the planning process, licenses granted, and then at the last minute, it completely bottled it and changed it and retracted and recanted.
No, hopefully they've learnt their lessons there. You know, we really need them to be a key stakeholder in this right to the end. And I think they get it, because they're keeping an eye on the auto industry, which they're trying to support. So we really need to see this through to fruition. And that's not just planning, that's into production and making a profit.
And there was an expression I read about, Andrew. I mean, lithium is almost like a new treasure. It's potentially so important that it might become, this expression, a critical raw material here in the UK. Because it's so vital towards these batteries and electric cars. Do you think people understand that enough? Because obviously the indirect jobs in the automotive industry are tens, if not hundreds of thousands.
This is a whole industry that sort of sprung up in the past 20 years. No other commodity on the planet is growing at 20-40% year on year. Wood, cement, they grow about 6% year on year. This is just booming. So we're creating, we need a project the size of us built every 6 months. So getting a strategic supply of these raw ingredients such as lithium is key to the UK economy. And it's not just the auto industry. If we want to use more and more renewables, how do we store that power, say overnight? Grid storage, there's just so many industries dependent on lithium batteries.
That's absolutely fascinating. And is it just Cornwall that lithium is believed to be present in the UK, or are there other parts of the UK?
There's other parts, there's parts of Scotland, Northern Ireland, Ireland as well, not within the UK, but I think Cornwall's got the advantage. It's got that mining legacy, and the areas that we're looking at have already been mined. They're already permitted as quarries, which makes it easy. We're not like we're disturbing a greenfield site.
Yes, I can understand that from a planning perspective. That is important, that mining history, and therefore that local enthusiasm for it. And in a sense, everywhere needs jobs, but Cornwall in particular, as fairly remote part of England, needs that investment in those jobs.
What Cornwall needs in terms of jobs is not just, they get a lot of seasonal work at the moment during the summer season, but what they need is year-round jobs that are high-paying, good quality jobs, which is the type of jobs we want to provide. Scientists, laboratory technicians, IT, mechanics, a lot of trade, a lot of semi-skilled and skilled labour.
That's fantastic. Well, just whilst we've been talking, Andrew, Peter from Stevenage, he says lithium in Cornwall, very important. Keep China and other powers out. We must start taking control of our industries. And I'm a great believer in much more self-reliance on a whole range of things. And actually, energy and raw materials for batteries and things, if we've got it, we should use it.
Absolutely. I think that's one thing we sort of learned from COVID, that we need to look at our supply chain. And, we're seeing shortages right across the planet. We can't allow ourselves to be dictated by the whims of China and Argentina. We have the capability to do it in the UK, so let's do it.
Andrew, you're so right. Thank you so much. That was a brilliant update. What I'd love to do, Andrew, is get you back on later in the year with an update on how it's going, how the planning's going, how the technology's going. I think that's a really exciting new development, a new opportunity. Andrew Smith, the Chief Executive of British Lithium, thank you so much. We wish you well in your endeavours. There we are. More bright news, more good news, more positive news, folks, about what's going on here in the UK. New industries, new technologies, new jobs. Absolutely fantastic. Stay with us. It's Tice Talk. It's Talk UK. No, it's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.
New. Best recipe ever. Talk Radio.
Captivating, campaigning, controversial. Powered by common sense.
May cause mild irritation.
The word on the street.
Standing up for the little guy.
Rewire your thinking.
Talk Radio.
Welcome back to Tice Talk. It's 12:47. We're approaching the top of the hour. It's still bright, it's still cheery, and we've had a very positive morning. And there we're just talking about a potential new industry, British lithium. But we've had a tweet in here from Rose who says, we may have lots of lithium in Cornwall, but what's the betting? We have loads of endangered newts or something else that means we cannot mine it. Well, certainly the issue of getting planning consent and overcoming any concerns is, of course, absolutely vital. But I'm encouraged. Cornwall has a rich mining history, and that should be good news. We've got some calls here. We've got Magdalene in West Sussex. Good afternoon to you. What would you like to say this bright afternoon?
Oh, hi there. So I called with regards to the mandatory vaccination for the healthcare workers coming into force from 1st of April.
Yeah, what's your view?
Well, I hope there's going to be a big U-turn on it. I'm a healthcare worker who's unvaccinated. I've got natural immunity. And I hope it won't come to this because we are going to lose an awful lot of healthcare workers, which is not beneficial to anybody.
Indeed, it's certainly not beneficial to anybody. We know, for example, at the moment, there are tens of thousands of healthcare workers who are isolating, not able to be in work. The idea of losing more is clearly not good news. And so you've been a healthcare worker for some time, have you, Magdalene? We may have lost. Have we got you back, Magdalene?
Yes, I'm there.
Yeah, just wondering. So you've been a healthcare worker for a long time, have you?
I've graduated as a dentist 24 years ago.
Right. Okay. As a dentist, and you're still working in dentistry.
Yes.
Got it. And so you saw the clip of the medic talking to the health secretary on Friday.
Correct. I have.
And so in a sense, you agree with his view, I think.
Oh, absolutely. But it should go further, since there is no difference in terms of transmission between vaccinated people and people who have never had coronavirus. I think there should be no mandates whatsoever. Because if we only allow vaccinated or previously infected healthcare workers to carry on with their duties, it would mean, for me personally, I'm going to lose my best nurse, because she hasn't had coronavirus and she is not vaccinated. But scientifically, there is no difference between her possibility to transmit anything to anybody versus anybody double or triple vaccinated.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? I mean, I'm a great believer. I've been jabbed. I've made that very clear. I'm pro-vaccine but pro-choice. And I think the idea of mandating it, I find unacceptable. And even more unacceptable is the idea in a critical industry, healthcare, that you're going to lose highly experienced, highly skilled staff who've made their own personal choice. I just think defies common sense. Magdalene, thank you so much for your thoughts there. That was Magdalene in West Sussex. Howard in Rotherham.
Hello there, Richard.
Hi, how are you getting on?
I'm fine, thank you. Yourself?
Yeah, fine. What would you like to say?
From my own matter of interest, we keep hearing all these people that are working for the NHS and commenting on the NHS. Does anyone have any figures on whether or not the private health sector, private hospitals, Bupa, etc., whether all their staff are vaccinated or whether they're on the same tack as the NHS?
It's a really good point, Howard. And the honest answer is I actually haven't seen any statistics on that. I think we've just heard from various people who say that they're not happy with it or that they are happy with it. One of the earlier callers was happy with it.
Be an interesting statistic to have a look at.
Yes, I haven't seen. Well, we'll see if we can get our statistician, Jamie. He's the guru of all things statistics. We'll ask him whether or not there's any data on that. But you're against mandatory vaccines, are you, Howard?
I'm split.
You're split.
I would love to see every member of the country vaccinated.
Right, okay.
But I also believe in people having a free choice.
Yes.
But the other thing that I believe in is, and I know it's a little bit political, etc., but if people are you've got a certain sector of the public that's refusing to be vaccinated, should they actually be allowed to, basically, the vaccine was introduced to give people freedom. And you understand where I'm going with this. I think basically, would I want to be stood in a pub having had all my vaccines next to someone who refuses to have them?
Well, I mean, I think the point is that what we know is that even if you've been vaccinated, double vaccinated, treble vaccinated, then people are still transmitting it and still being reinfected. Indeed, many are actually being infected twice. What we do know is that it provides protection. That's the key indisputable advantage.
Yeah, the thing about it is this, Richard, that the people that are getting double infected are not getting double infected with the same variant. They're getting the second infection is of a later variant.
And in a sense, Howard, that of course we know that viruses will mutate, they will vary, and we should expect that, give or take, every year for a number of years to come.
What I'm trying to make is if you've been vaccinated for measles, doesn't mean that you're immune to getting smallpox.
No,
if you understand what I mean.
No, I do indeed. So I'm a bit concerned you're a bit like Sir Keir Starmer, sort of sitting on the fence and getting splinters, Howard.
Well, that be as it may, Richard. The thing about it is this: I'm not medically qualified to make any other judgment than what I hear, what I read, and what I see people saying. All I think, in my own humble opinion, is that the whole of the medical profession, the whole of the pharma profession, the majority of the government profession, everybody's trying to do the best.
That's right. Just before I let you go, Howard, just one bit of information that my wonderful production team have produced for me is that the regulations for mandatory vaccines for healthcare staff does apply equally across both the public sector, the NHS, and the independent healthcare sector. Howard, thank you very much for those thoughts. That was Howard in Rotherham with his thoughts. Just a couple of tweets that have come in from various people. Oliver says, you should always ask with these mining licenses if they intend to sell at market rates, which means the price will be no lower than international prices, or they might sell abroad. Well, yes, of course they should be, in my view, at market rates, but it's much more sustainable and much cheaper to sell lithium that's mined in Cornwall to producers elsewhere in the United Kingdom. And I think that is a real opportunity. Another one here from, I think it's Noma, who wasn't convinced by the sports cardiologist guest, Sanjay Sharma, basing his information on a limited snapshot. He's a restricted range. Well, in a sense, he admitted that yes, it's a restricted number because the number of footballers is relatively small compared to the data that he was showing. But in a sense, that's what we've got to do, is we've got to keep getting the data. You weren't convinced by the research and information from the FA. Well, that's why we've got to keep asking questions, to keep getting that data. That builds trust, that builds confidence, which is so important. Well, it has been a busy show, folks. I hope that you've enjoyed it. We've had lots of great guests. Jeremy Richardson from the social care sector with his thoughts about the latest. Some extraordinary statistics he put out that whilst every death is sad, only 1.2% of his deaths currently in the social care sector are from people with COVID. You don't hear that from the government, do you? And then the interview with Sanjay Sharma about what's going on with footballers, the research that's being carried out by both the clubs themselves, with a raft of top cardiologists who are comparing data, pooling data, and then sharing that with the FA. And talking of sharing information and pooling information, I've just been joined by Bob Mills in the studio.
Hello,
How are
mate,
you?
you all right?
Very lovely
Cracking
to see you.
show.
Lovely to see you. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling good, man.
And what gems are you going to be sharing with our listeners
I
this
tell you
afternoon?
what a lovely first hour. We got Lance Ellington, a brilliant singer who was the lead singer on Strictly. And he's got new music out. And then I'm looking forward to this. Do you watch the Great Pottery Throwdown?
No.
Well,
help me.
well, Keith Brimmer-Jones. Keith Brimmer-Jones, who's now a highly respectable member of the world of pottery and ceramics. I remember meeting him many, many years ago when he was the lead singer of the punk band The Wigs. So I shall be bringing that up with him, certainly.
Okay, right. That's
no, and then lovely. You know what it is, the Oasis show with nice topics. No arguments, no big discussions. You do all that.
Oh, well, we've done a bit of that today.
Yes.
And it's been bright, it's been positive. Like the weather, it's been
It
really
is.
cheery.
Do you know what it is? We're coming out of there. There's no question.
Yeah,
now.
we're coming out. Things are getting better. Things are getting bluer, brighter, optimistic. And my glass is definitely half full, not half empty. Stay with us. You've been listening to Talk Radio. Coming up, we've got the wonderful Bob Mills. Thanks for listening. Thanks for being with us. Don't go anywhere. You've been listening to Tice Talk. It's Talk Radio.
Good talk.
Hot talk. Bold talk. Talk Radio.
Listen on your smart speaker.
Watch it live on your smart TV.
The world headquarters of common sense.
Talk Radio.
Offence archaeology on Twitter. Quite terrifying.
Don't beg Jeff Bezos. Charge him, for God's sake.
Have a day off. Use some common sense.
People can say whatever they want.